So good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the Research Center for Women's Studies, I welcome everyone to the to the IAWS Western Regional Conference on the theme of this gender and citizenship. So we begin straight away. I'll now, in fact, we begin. Yeah, we begin with the address of the IAWS, this president. So now I invite I invite the president to kindly address the audience. Uh, Dr. Meera.
On behalf of the IAWS EC, I'm really happy that we are able to do the Western Regional Conference because since this EC took in 2018, early 2018, it has become very increasingly very difficult to hold even regional conferences. So for the first time in an EC, we have only had two regional conferences, and the other two that have been held have been virtual sort of conferences. Not only that, even local collaborations have become very difficult, including for the national conference, and therefore it also just sort of points to the kind of situation that we are passing through. And as IAWS EC also came through, also started the whole decline in funding, the whole cut in funding in women's studies centers, and also, the plan itself was given up. So a lot of coincidences and increasingly situation getting very, very difficult for IAWS. So I'm really happy that IAWS, the Western Regional Conference, with all these difficulties and now with so many collaborations, you're able to really put together very good panels that I can see, and I could only just follow all the process itself. I'd just like to say only one or two points only about today's sessions. One is the Women's Studies Centers, the discussion on women's studies. And for IAWS, I tell you, this EC we've had from the beginning. We've been sending memorandums and meeting UGC every month almost. We are sending because the funds, when as soon as we took over, we found the funds had not come for a long time. Women's study centers were closing. It was affecting so many, the teaching, the administrative, and the students. And so almost now I was looking at all the IAWS documents and seeing that almost every month we were intervening and having dialogue with the UGC as well as the education secretary. And then I think the good thing that happened is we were able to get together when once in March 2019, when the new guidelines were introduced without any dialogues with women's studies centers or with IAWS, which used to be in the past. Once the guidelines came, we actually got together the women's studies centers and all the different issues, all the different phases that the funding was going through, and when they came into being, we could sort of get together a kind of history of the women's studies centers as well as put across the issues, and therefore we managed to press the UGC to the guidelines became a draft guidelines. So I think that was all the women's studies centers played a big role in that, in sort of putting that pressure. And we were able to, guidelines which was announced to make it into a draft, although they gave us just about a month to give the feedback. And after giving the feedback from the women's studies centers, we've really not had, there you don't get a response. Even presenting before the standing committee, we had Anaga, myself, and Mani Mekhle, we had presented on behalf of the Women's Studies Centers all the issues of women's centers, but there was just total silence in the room. There's no response even then, there at present, and we never get a response. And I think that is a big issue because we are sending this and there's no dialogue in that sense because it's one-sided. And women's study on the meanwhile, the women's studies centers have, they've been continuing those in different ways, how to strategize, in these conditions when the funds are not coming through from UGC, what should be done. So like in Goa itself, they tried different kind of strategies to, sort of how to move ahead. I think they've given some directions how to move ahead. Similarly, I think many of the centers, including TIS and the Pune centers, have also pedagogy, the different kind of, there have been some, very key sort of advances in those directions. And I think those are sort of positives that we can take from that. So, in the discussion, all of this will come in. So I won't take many very long on that. I'll just say that on behalf of IAWS, uh, we are increasingly finding it that we are playing this role of uh, sort of carrying all the different kind of demands of the women's studies centers, but we really need to also strategize now state-wise. And I think increasingly that is going to be the strategy that we can come across, because again, now we are in uncertainty. Only till March we have the women's studies centers have funding. And then again, the next round of dialogues pushing the UGC, and it's totally uncertain what could happen next in terms of the overall crisis. And of course, the whole struggle of the women's movement and IAWS as part of that movement and women's studies movement has been for justice, for constitutional values, and also in terms of what has been or what has not been the response of the state and the government to different kind of crises that particularly the vulnerable sections are facing. So I think this in this these two sessions here will address some of these issues. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Meera. And now I'll invite Professor Vibhuti Patel, who is the convener of the conference, to address the audience.
Yeah.
Professor Vibhuti Patel. Yeah.
Dear friends, we are extremely happy with your presence in this regional conference. In its 4 decades of contributions towards strengthening women's studies as an academic discipline with transformatory potential, IAWS has been sensitive to regional specificity and has provided platform to both researchers and practitioners, policymakers and academicians for exchange of ideas and experiences through its regional conferences. Many of you must have remembered the regional conference organized by Professor Amita Verma, Neera Desai, and Trupti Shah in Baroda MS University, and Chaya Dattar had organized similar regional conference in the TISS rural campus. And we know that so many nuances that emerged, and the current executive committee also has taken decision to organize the Western Regional Conference on challenges faced by women's studies in Western India in the very first meeting in 2018. And Dr. Varsha Joshi, professor at India Institute of Development Studies, Jaipur, had agreed to host the conference. We also made the preliminary work with for funding with ICSSR, but the UGC circular, as Meera said, of stopping the plant grant to 144 women's studies centers in the university system created an existential crisis for the women's studies movement, and IAWS took a lead role in protecting women's studies center. So IAWS channelized its energy in bringing all women's studies centers together to make a united effort to highlight their major problems during 2019. On 31st January 2020, immediately after the national conference, executive committee decided to organize Western Regional Conference with an overarching theme of gender and citizenship in collaboration with Research Center for Women's Studies, SNDT Women's University, and Dr. Putul Sate had made plan for accommodation and other logistic requirements, but coronavirus changed everything, and the EC decided to organize this conference online. And we received enthusiastic response from the collaborating institutes, Dr. Putul Sate from SNDT, Dr. Ananda Amrit Mahal from Principal of Sophia College, Dr. Lata Pujari, and Dipti Anil from Sophia Center for Women's Studies and Development, Dr. Jitendra Aherkar, Principal, and also his colleague, Dr. Aruna Singham from BL Amlani College for Women, and Dr. Vaishali Divekar, Head of the Department of Sociology of St. Veera's College for Girls, and the EC members, Kiran Moke and Professor Ritu Diwan, President of IAWS from 2014 to 17. They also were very active in this preparatory work. And we will be failing in our duty if we don't acknowledge Professor Ritu Diwan, who put in great efforts to finalize the Power Pact 5 panels, and also acted as our conscience keeper with constant reminder of meeting, because we had Diwali vacation and we had so many, everybody was also, all the 4 colleges were also extremely busy with the online exam and the crisis which it created. So moral support of the current president, Dr. Meera Velayudhan, and secretary, Dr. Anaka Tambe, as well as all EC members, we gratefully acknowledge, and the organizing team is really thankful to them. We have included 2 thematic areas for today's deliberations. As you know, the status of women's studies centers in Western India, both the problems and prospects, and within and outside academic institution. A lot of women's studies work is happening in the women's movement. So many robust research reports and research endeavor has been happening outside academia also. And we acknowledge that. And the second theme, the question of citizenship in the current context of coronavirus, has made it imperative to seriously examine multiple and intersecting layers of its impact on gender relations determined by marginalities, multiple marginalities, and the exclusion based on class, caste, race, ethnicity, religion, and sexual orientation. And once again, I thank you all for attending this conference, and request that all 4 days, please, all of you should attend the conference. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Vibhuti Patel. And now I'll request Dr. Vatsala Shukla from RCWS to, to take over. Yeah, so over to Dr. Vatsala Shukla.
Thank you, Dr. Putul Sate. As we conclude the inaugural session of the 4-day IAWS Western Regional Conference and proceed with the panel discussions of day 1, coordinated by the Research Center for Women's Studies, SNDT Women's University, Mumbai. Let's welcome our eminent panelists for session 1. The theme for the first panel discussion is the status of women's studies in Western India. It's indeed a proud privilege for me to introduce our distinguished speakers briefly. Our first speaker for this session is Professor Shaila D'Souza. She's professor and head Department of Women's Studies at Goa University, where she's been championing the cause of women's studies for the past 3 decades almost. She had served on several advisory bodies, including the EC of IAWS, Goa State Commission for Women, and many others. So let's welcome Dr. Shaila D'Souza. Our second speaker for this panel is Dr. Nirmala Jadhav. She's Director, Tarabai Shinde Women's Studies Center at Baba Saheb Ambedkar, Marathwada University, Aurangabad. She has done her, as regards her academic excellence, she has done her PhD and MPhil in English and NET in Women's Studies. She has to her credit various publications. She's translated various articles and books on gender and women's studies like V. Geeta and Kamla Bhasin. She has written books on female feticide. She's organized Mukta Salve, Simone de Beauvoir lectures at Tarabai Shinde Women's Studies Center. She has edited 8 books related to Western feminist thinkers, and she's edited Tarabai Shinde Women's Studies Center's annual journal as well. She's completed various research projects on gender and textbook and challenges before women's studies centers in Maharashtra. She's been writing articles in the various reputed feminist journal. I welcome Dr. Nirmala Jadhav. Our next speaker is Dr. Swati Dahad Roy. She's a faculty at Kranti Jyoti Savitribai Phule Women's Studies Center, Savitribai Phule, Pune University, Pune. She has completed her PhD in sociology. Her major areas of interest include gender and Hindutva and gender and development. Her ongoing research involves cultural heritage and identities of Europe's future. She has assisted in many research projects. She has completed many research projects as well. She has to her credit several publications. I welcome Dr. Swati. Next, our next speaker is Professor Veena Gopal. She is chairperson of Advanced Center for Women's Studies, School of Development Studies of Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Earlier, she was a senior lecturer at the RCWS SNDT Women's University and contributed a great deal towards the development of the teaching, research, and training programs of the center. A PhD in sociology from JNU, Professor Veena Gopal has written extensively, and her research-based scholarly articles were published in reputed national and international journals. She has completed several independent and collaborative research projects and the programs of the Department of Women and Child Development of Maharashtra. Her research interests have been in the areas of gender and labor, political economy of health, wealth and welfare and development, sexuality studies and social movements. As an academic, researcher and activist, Dr. Veena Gopal has been actively involved in Forum Against Oppression of Women and PUCL, People's Union of Civil Liberties. I welcome Professor Veena Gopal. The moderator for this session is Professor Veena Punacha. Professor Veena Punacha is former director, RCWS SNDT Women's University. Indeed, it was under her stewardship that center has taken an initiative to establish Dr. Awabai Wadia Archives for Women in 2009. She was also the honorary director of Center for Rural Development. She has initiated various teaching courses at the center and has been an inspiration to all young women who join the center. She has had a long and distinguished career as educationist, teacher, and researcher in the interdisciplinary areas of history, sociology, and social anthropology. She has to her credit several national and international publications. Her forte is feminist research methodology, oral histories, oral life histories. She is a prolific writer and constantly writes and is committed to expand and enrich the knowledge of women's studies with her dynamic vision of society. She has been awarded with Australia-India Council Senior Fellowship and recently in 2015, Maharshi Karve Utkrishta Shikshak Samman. Her current study involves an oral history project in which she aims at reconstructing the oral history of the Kurg district in Karnataka. I now hand over the session to Professor Veena Punacha, who is moderating this session.
Thank you, Vatsala, for that very warm welcome. Being here today is like being at home. And I would like to begin by thanking the IAWS for having invited me to moderate this session. We all know that, as Meera has pointed out, all the research centers, women's studies research centers, are at a very critical crossroads in the world, in India, partly because of the rise of various kinds of fundamentalisms and the larger socio-economic conditions which are increasing the oppression of women, particularly according to caste, class, and of course, gender. As we look at the rigidity of the situation, apart from the administrative problems and the insecurities that women's studies centers face, we also need to address the issue of polemics, fundamentalisms of various kinds, which refuse to come into a common platform for discourse and dialogue. The freedom to narrate, to talk, to speak freely is increasingly narrowed by this fundamentalist space. What we do find is that also at this moment, university education itself is at a very, very critical cross situation. The old university structures that we have known is now on its way out, and increasingly teachers and scholars have to grapple with this double modes of online learning and offline teaching. Moreover, to an extent, this is the ideal moment for women's studies, at one way of looking at it, because women's studies is essentially an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary area of study, which can borrow theories from across the board. And yet, at another level, the university systems are also existing in an increasingly capitalist economy, and centralization from the political powers, the lack of autonomy within the universities. And what does this mean to be a women's studies discipline without a recognized, accepted, acknowledged status within the university system? Women's studies centers, as Meera has just pointed out, are grappling with the issue of funds, lack of staff, particularly I'm talking of state-run universities, and not those which get a lot of support from the management. And at the same time, there are practical pedagogic problems of dealing with an ideology which is revolutionary, critical, and challenging, and at the same time, needing to fit into a rigid structure. I know each member of the panel in this forum, Swati, Meena, Nirmala Jadhav, and Shaila have struggled, particularly Shaila, Swati, Meena, have struggled for many years in this discipline out of a commitment for it. And I'm fully aware of the strategy, the trajectories of their growth. So I think we will listen to them and try to make sense on the way forward. Being in women's studies has never been an easy exercise. And some of the issues which are coming up here is something we have been grappling in from the beginning of women's studies within the university system. I now call upon the first speaker, Shaila, to give her address.
Thanks, Veena. I don't have a very formal address, but I have a couple of ideas that I would like to throw at this panel and to those who are attending the panel discussion. I agree with Veena about the negotiations that we have to constantly make in the discipline like we are in. But I don't think that is something unique to women's studies. We do have to tread carefully to pursue the agenda of women's studies. But I think that most critical disciplines like women's studies, maybe political science, and if critical sociology also has that, although UGC has been saying ever since the 9th plan that we need to move from centers to departments. Can I be heard? Because, okay. So although UGC has been saying move from a center to department, this historical problem of the women's studies program all over the country, and I mean, here we're talking about the Western zone, it's already different, that most of us have been dependent on the UGC for funding for the longest time. And you know, it's very disturbing to hear constantly of the crib of irregular funding. I think the Goa's experience of ever since the year 2013, moving to more permanency within the state has been so beneficial for us in terms of even recognition. I mean, we've been, can I be heard?
No, your voice is breaking.
Okay, I'm going to take out my headphones. Is this better?
Yeah, this is better.
Okay, so So I was talking about our historical dependence on UGC for funding, and that really should change. And we need more permanency within our states with funding from within the university. And what it does, it also helps us get recognized as a discipline, because we need to move from the nomenclature of a center to department. It's so important for us to be recognized as a discipline. Is for women studies to work with the Human Resource Development Ministry to recognize MA in Women's Studies or PhDs in Women's Studies for jobs, internships, for all government departments. Because the moment Women's Studies is included in the recruitment rules for all jobs, we'll see a sea change in in the way women's studies is seen. I think an increase in the availability of jobs will increase the demand for MA Women's Studies and increase our bargaining power within our states to create women's studies as a separate discipline and therefore get funding. I'm glad to say that Goa University now has 7 full-time positions funded by the state government. Just recently, we've had 5 new, apart from myself, who's been there for eons, 5 new positions that have been filled, and the positions, the staff have come from very disciplines, because we don't have candidates, and Goa had this domicile role, but I must say that it's working very well, and we still need to get the staff well into the discipline of women's studies. But that is again one of the biggest problems. The biggest problem with the women's studies discipline is that there is this notion within universities that anyone can do women's studies. And I think that problem stems from the fact that we don't have, all of us teach different, there's no common pedagogy that we all follow. I mean, everyone's teaching a different syllabus for MA women's studies. And I feel that although there is a growing number of students in our MA program, there's a huge demand in PhD, and but evidenced by the fact that there are 50, 60 students registering for our optional courses, just shows that there is a demand for women's studies. Now, coming back to the whole problem of this variation in the kinds of centers, some are teaching departments, some are only engaged in extension activities, some are research centers, activities that are really problematic from the women's studies perspective, such as running beauty training programs or for self-employment. And the concern of this variation in the syllabus in MA programs reflects also in the kind of questions that are posed in the NET examination. I think the NET examination is another problematic area that we need to look at, because many questions that are even asked in the NET exam are incorrect and are not even suited for multiple choice answers. Then there's this whole concern of, should we be working at an undergraduate program, and will that help building this discipline here. An MA program, we have a successful PhD program, but what is our real contribution of all these? Women's studies has been around for 30 years and more in this country, and definitely in the Western region with TISS, SNDT, and much later Goa University. We have been around since 1988. But what has our real contribution been to building up to theory, to feminist theory? Have our departments really developed expertise in any certain research area, or are we still having to dabble in everything? And I think right now, I am thinking about where do I think what plans do I have for this department? How can we expand? And when I think about that, the biggest area where women's studies in Goa has made a big difference is in public policy. And so recently we have, as a department, accepted to join a school, a larger school, which is the School for Law, Governance, and Public Policy. And so Department of Women's Studies will join this School of Public Policy, where we will have tribal studies, disability studies, law, governance. And I do think that if we can really impact public policy, that would be a way in which we would get our feet firmly on the ground in terms of recognition as a discipline, and help really build this and take this forward. Thank you. I end with my presentation here, and we can discuss the story of Goa University's trajectory and how we moved from a center dependent on UGC to a state-funded department. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
I request Nirmala to make her presentation now.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really thankful to IAWS and Putul, Vatsala, and all the coordinating institutes for giving me this opportunity to share my views here. And also I'm very honored and pleased to be part of this panel with Meena, Swati, also Sela D'Souza ma'am, and also Veena Punacha ma'am. While listening all these views, really I'm confused what to say, because these are the same things we have been really discussing and negotiating and fighting with all these, but they haven't changed, but still we have to fight with them. So really it's a big challenge for us to think over. For myself, being from the Women's Studies Center at the Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Marathwada University, compared to our rural area, I can say. There are many different challenges we are facing, and also there are, I think, while talking about those differences, we must also somewhere clarify that, as everybody said now, that these are the challenges somewhere not related only to the Women's Studies Center, but they are somewhere related to the overall crisis the higher education or the education sector is facing now, because as we can see that in most of the education or the universities, the technical and the vocational education is being prioritized over the arts or the social sciences. And in this race, the women's studies, the discipline like women's studies, which are comparatively very new and non-professional, they have to fight with them, and also they have to negotiate with the university authorities there, which are really very in a way patriarchal or the main. So how to really face this the crisis in the whole education sector, and there are many I feel there are many long-term challenges which we have been discussing, that there is the lack of competition of the students in the English language, or the lack of reading material in the English languages, or the lack of space or the physical infrastructure, or the patriarchal mindset of the authority. These all the challenges there which we have been fighting, but the urgent crisis I think we all are facing from at least the 2017 when the 12th plan ended. There's an issue of the fund, as said, it's already said, but it's a major issue I think, because it's really in a way affecting the women's study centers. Especially we surveyed the women's study centers in Maharashtra, and we felt that especially the women's study centers in colleges, most of the colleges, they have literally closed down the women's study centers because the UGC is not releasing the funds, and that's why they say that we are not getting the money. That's why they have changed, or just for the namesake, the nameplates of the women's study centers are there. No activities are being run there. So it is very frustrating, especially at the college level, and in the universities also. I don't think there is a uniformity like the women's study centers in the like Pune and the Mumbai, they are in the at the better position. But when we look at the women's study centers in the Nagpur, Jalgaon, or the Amravati, or even Aurangabad, the situation is, I think, becoming worse, or we have to deal in a major way with the women's study, the university authorities, because somewhere that established or that image we are not having with us. So we have to, in a way, prove to the university authorities that we are something, and we will get the money from the university, UGC, and so let us well, uh, let us work in the centers. So I think, but I don't know how we are. The IAWS is continuously, as Meera said, continuously negotiating with the UGC to release the funds, but the issue is not being solved because UGC just giving the public notices, but till the university receives the funds, they are not allowing the women's study centers to work, to organize the programs. Even they are not even releasing the salary of the staff, because they are saying just public notices of no use if the UGC doesn't release the funds. So how we can run these women's studies center? So this is a very material and the concrete problem issue without which we cannot go ahead. And also the major another thing is the permanency of the staff or the regularization of the staff. Due to that, at least before this plan period, we were having this good time of 5 years to organize the things. But as it's ended in the 2017, now the government is just giving the extension for 1 year, and it's really affecting in a very bad way to the programs, to the overall functioning of the women's studies centers, because the especially when many of the staff, they are leaving because they are getting the good opportunities. So the vacant posts, they are not being fulfilled, because in 1 year we can't do the university process. It's just get the permission, it gets 2-3 months, and to advertise and all this, it's a lengthy process, and this 1 year really doesn't happen. So I feel we should at least negotiate with UGC, HRDC, I don't know in which way, but to focus that at least the women's study centers should get 5 or 10 years time period to really run in a smooth way, we can say. And this 1 year is also affecting that the women's studies personnel or the staff, they are not being considered anywhere. They, in our universities itself, they are not, the women's studies staff, they are not even considered to be eligible to give the allot the university residential quarters, or even to us some additional charges there. So somewhere this position of women's study centers is becoming really insecure, or the with so many challenges. So I feel this issue of permanency is very significant. I know all of us are fighting for that, but still this issue is, I feel, has not moved on. The next one is the, I think, I feel that already the problems are discussed, but somewhere I feel to really expand this horizons of women's studies, I feel this women's studies subject or the discipline should be introduced at the undergraduate and the school level, because as we don't have the undergraduate basis, the employment opportunity of the students also gets very limited. So I feel somewhere we should continuously negotiate with the state governments and also the UGC, HRDC to introduce this subject of women's studies as a gender orientation at the school levels, like the value education, it should be added. And also at the school level, at the college level, we have the environment studies as a mandatory paper there. So like we should have this women's studies as a compulsory component in college levels in all the disciplines or all the faculties. So this I feel will expand the employment opportunities for the women studies students and the faculties as well. And for employment opportunities, as Shaila also said, that somewhere we must negotiate to include this subject in the recruitment at least women and child welfare ministry or the MPSC or the institutes working on the women. Uh, uh, so I think these are the some major things we should really, instead of we talking, some solution we should come with, because everybody, all of us know these problems, but don't know the solutions. And when we are discussing about the status of women's studies in the Western region, I feel that how we are going to analyze or discuss this status, because as we talked about this status in the physical material, the infrastructural conditions, the status of the women's studies is really in a way very delicate or not very good. But when I think of myself at women's studies, the status I feel at my individual level is very enthusiastic, or the with great zeal, because in spite of all these adversities, we can see that almost all the women studies centers they are doing very well. They are continuously organized various programs. The response of the students or the audience to these programs is also very good. The students from various disciplines and the various subjects, they are coming to these programs and the courses to this of women studies, and they also want, the many students or the researchers, they want to do their studies or issues related with women. Even many researchers come to our libraries to refer the books and to the resources. Various college teachers also wants to come and organize some courses or to some joint programs with the women studies centers. I think the things which are required for any discipline to be, establish itself as a discipline, there are there with women studies, but only because due to these all these institutional hurdles, like the funds, the permanency of the staff, the physical space, or the infrastructure required for that, this zeal is somewhere, I think, being killed there. Like at college level, we can see the women study centers are being closed there, and only some universities, at least, they are trying to live or trying to survive. So I feel uh, all of us are trying our best to uh, make this women studies discipline strong, but these issues should be, I think, discussed in a serious way, and some concrete or the collective action should be done, which will at least grab the public attention, or some policies. Government should feel that pressure, that something concrete should be done for women study center, because so many incidences of violences are like the Hathras, and many numerous incidents are taking. Everybody is talking about this violence and the gender equality and all this thing, but the preventive measures are really the gender orientation, which needs to be done at the school and the colleges level to stop such kind of the mentality and the such incidents. But it's never being discussed anywhere in the media or in the government level. So I feel these are the things the women studies centers or the IAWS should grab and try to discuss, and somewhere this the significance of women's studies should be, I think, brought to the notice of the government and the media and the public. Uh, I think there are many issues they are there to discuss. That our Women Study Center is also at as I said earlier, is at the rural areas. The students are also coming from very rural with non-English competency. But still, we are very, despite all these academic, what I can say, disadvantages, we are very happy with our work, because honestly, we are trying to survive and to make to build this discipline. So we are happy with this, but the challenges are there. Uh, uh, and the university authorities are really changing, because as Shaila said, we have to continuously negotiate with the universities and the government. But after a point, we really become helpless, and it's really waste our time and our energy, and also the motives and the, I think, intentions also, because beyond that we cannot do. Like yesterday only that happened, that the universities are not allowing us to even utilize our funds, because they are saying you didn't get the funds from 2017-18, and now 2020-21 is also not released, so you just plan your programs after getting the funds from UGC. And the when we call to at the UGC, they don't receive the calls. If they receive the calls, some ambiguous answer is given. So it's total, in a way, very frustrating situation is there. So I think I will stop here. It would be better. It would be good if we discuss all these things, and some concrete solution we will come at. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
I request thank you, Nirmala. I request Swati to take the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm really thankful to RCWS, Putul Vatsala, and Professor Vibhuti Patel, and IAWS, of course, for giving me this opportunity to talk about the state of women's studies in Western region. And as I think the stage has been set by Shaila and Nirmala, and both of them have very well articulated the problems and the institutional difficulties, as well as research and academic difficulties we all of us in the women's studies are facing. And so I'm just only will talk about little bit about then the problems in terms of how do we build our academics in that sense, how do we build our curriculum. And as Nirmala rightly pointed out, all of us who are located in Maharashtra and those who are not maybe in the central university or the central institutes face this problem of language. And that is what Nirmala has extensively spoke about. And so how do we address two or three issues in the larger context of higher education? One is about the diversity in terms of students and the teachers and researchers who are coming into the women's studies. So it is not only that we are getting students who are diverse in terms of caste, region, and language wise, as we are also getting teachers and researchers who are also coming in from diverse backgrounds. And how do we address that particular point on the site of women's studies? Because those who are coming into, when we look at the space of higher education, we always have this idea that the space of higher education is changing. And we always, in different ways, celebrate the diversity, that yes, diverse people who were earlier or up till now who were excluded are now getting included into the space of higher education. But when higher education is becoming so tentative and when opportunities are getting so limited, then what we will do with those who are coming in from the margins, like women, Dalit women, and women from the tribes and other backward caste and class, when they are coming into the space of higher education, that space is already shrinking. So instead, yes, it is one thing is that we need to be happy that those who were excluded are coming into the space of higher education. And then can we address this issue on the site of women's studies through our curricular practices and through our everyday practices, which we follow in the women's studies? The second point which I would like to raise is about the language issue, because all of us are struggling with this issue of language, because we always feel that there is something which is more in English as well, and when we are teaching in Marathi, or for us, because we come from Maharashtra, we teach in Marathi or in regional languages, then we feel that we are not giving them what is actually they need to read and they need to interpret. So whatever is translated, like for instance, one way out at our center, we thought of having translation of major works which we are referring into the classroom for each paper. We have had a translation of those articles, summarized translation of those articles in Marathi for the students who are opting for Marathi medium. But obviously we always feel the gap that if they're not reading the original English article, they are depending upon the interpretation which translator has done. And at this moment, all of us at the center can speak both the languages, English and Marathi, but we can't assume that each and every center in Maharashtra or in our center also later, we will have a faculty who will speak both the languages. And apart from the question of language, which is about English and Marathi, we also get in Pune University students who are coming in from like not more numbers, but few students who are coming in from Hindi belt, who are not comfortable with English. They are also not comfortable in Marathi because they are from Hindi medium. So how we feel always helpless, and we always talk to our Marathi medium students that look at them, at least you have faculty who can speak to you in Marathi, and you have a material which we can provide you in Marathi. But what about the students who are coming in from the different regions to university? And this is not only a problem for women's studies, but it is, I want to locate it on the ground of the higher education, site of the higher education, because all disciplines are talking about the issue of that, how do we communicate academically to students with the different kind of languages. So on one hand, it is easy to say that English is a medium of instruction in the space of higher education, but when you have students who can't read English or who can't understand what you're speaking in class, how do we teach subject matter? And so can we have a deliberation more on that, how do we deal with this idea of language? And this is an important issue for all of us, because when we are talking about research, we always talk about that we need to refer to the language, the sources which are regional for our research, which makes our research more interesting, more academically intense research, and we could bring out something new to the academic discourse if we refer to region. And at that point, we go back to the regional language and we learn different languages, or we try and converse, and then we produce the article which mainly maybe I will not produce it in English or Marathi, or I will only produce it in Marathi and not in English. So if this is the in between space, if we are traversing through, then how do we actually address the issue of language as not a question of English versus regional language, or in terms of, do I access as a researcher, as a teacher, and as a student, do I access? And because now the space of higher education, where in the states universities, teachers and students are also, both are coming in from different backgrounds, class, caste and region wise. So how do we address that issue? And third, and the last point which I would like to introduce is about the curriculum. So Nirmala had rightly pointed out that if we want to increase the employment opportunities for our students who are doing masters in women's studies, we need to introduce women's studies maybe at undergraduate level or for the 11th and 12th standard also. But then how do we look at curriculum building, the exercise of curriculum building, that how do we build curriculum which is whether, because earlier in social science, the entire debate, if we look at the building up of discipline and disciplinary borders and boundaries, we had at one point in late 90s and early 2000, we had a discussion about whether we can have the borders and boundaries for the discipline. So do we really need to build an ideal curriculum or a model curriculum? So if we believe in the spirit of that particular dialogue and that particular debate, that should we constrain the imagination of what we read and write in as a part of women's studies? If we do not want to restrict it, then how do we produce a curriculum which will be which will provide or have some kind of a framework through which we address the major disciplinary concerns which are there for women's studies? And do we all agree that we need to have some kind of those broad canvas of that this is what we need to underline or need to address in the name of women's studies. So as Shaila and Nirmala both were talking about vocational or the extension and other activities which as women's studies we bound to take, and we are forced to take those activities, then how do we in a sense build women's studies curriculum without losing its status as the discipline which is having a sign like I don't know, but the rational and a scientific inquiry into the subject matter. And so the question for me is, and many of us at the center, Anaga and I did a ICSSR sponsored research project on mapping women's studies across India. In that, what we have realized is that there are favorite topics for all of us in the women's studies departments across India. Being development in that is the most favorite one. Then we can't escape methodology course or feminist theory course. But how do we build a logic when we are floating a 4-semester or a 2-year MA master's program? So what kind of link and how we interlink those issues together? And lastly, about this idea of then building a curriculum which will address questions related to diversity, which is there in the higher education. And especially if I have students who are coming in from the diverse backgrounds to my classroom, when I teach that, yes, for me, it is maybe theoretically, I'm explaining that woman is not a homogeneous category, but what are the sources I'm using in the classroom to teach, and then to get students know that it is not whether my individual experience of being woman is same through the other woman or not, but there is a theoretical way we are trying to argue. And so to build in the interdisciplinary aspect or interdisciplinarity in building the curriculum in women's studies. So if we are, and so to go back to the challenges which both of earlier speakers were talking about, if we really are interested in doing this, as both of them have pointed out, we need a firm infrastructure. We need a faculty who is continuously engaging with this subject. So there is no escape in terms of like we have to have the earlier we different feminist researchers and like I only remember right now Niraben who talked about Nira Desai, who talked about that how they have to do this double duty in not in terms of domestic work and the work in the outside world, but they were talking about going back to the discipline, talking about gender and coming to the site of women's studies to build women's studies. So maybe for us now at this juncture in the space of higher education, where all disciplines are complaining about faculty crunch, funding crunch related to funding. So when it is not specific, only specific to women's studies, how do we build solidarities amongst other disciplines? And so to again go back to the question of interdisciplinarity and building coalitions and politics to, as both of them were saying, that how IAWS helps us to negotiate with the state or UGC or any other funding agency. At the same time, how do we build alliance with our other departments, which I am aware that it is difficult in institutional structures, but how do we actually build interdisciplinary scholarship and do maybe all of us are forced and all of us are happily doing that double work of building women's studies as academic discipline, as well as continuously struggling to sustain and to survive. And like Shaila and Nirmala have shared their own history of their women's studies centers. Yes, for us also, like except one position, all of us are on the temporary position. So how do we actually deal with it? And so as Nirmala pointed out, there are several issues in everyday life which makes it difficult to address academic issues when you are not on a firm ground, because bureaucracy and institution recognizes some rules and regulations, and accordingly they deal with your demands and deal with your suggestions. And so it is important that women's studies centers need to get the structural stability, and along with that structural stability, can we think about building a academic community which also debate around the issues which are right now very important. Thank you.
I request Meena. Thank you, Swati. I request Meena to make her presentation.
Sure. Thank you very much to the Indian Association of Women's Studies and the organizers of the Western Regional workshops. I'm quite delighted to be here. I also want to thank both Shaila, Nirmala for bringing out the crises that the centers, especially, which are in the regions, facing, and the various ways in which they've tried to deal with it. I thank Swati for actually laying out some of the strategies, visions, which they've tried to practice. And in a way, in what she ended as having a sustained academic community, I will build on that. So what I'm going to actually talk about is how to expand the labors of mentoring. It's with great satisfaction and pride that we acknowledge the work of feminists in the realm of theorizing labor in society, be it removing the invisibility of paid work, expanding the notion of the sexual division of labor through foregrounding social reproduction, and the slow chipping away at social policy. To name a few of the early trend centers, Maitreyi Krishnaraj, Nirmala Banerjee, Devaki Jain, Geeta Sen, from whose knowledges one has benefited both while I was working at the SNDT Women's University at the Research Center and now at TISS. This knowledge found its way through movement spaces that spoke of the labors of women who broke their silences in collectives challenging patriarchy, through songs and slogans at conferences, and through writings of feminist economists entering the classrooms of women's studies centers. This travel has enriched our own understandings while also taking it to policy spaces and legislative forums, as Shaila is suggesting. Women's studies thus today stands in a privileged space. I'd like to sort of state that, out front, that we're quite privileged in the fact of having, a field of our own in that sense, as Mary John said. It's even built its own institutional spaces, both within the university and outside. We have become quite a formidable force in strength and shape. However, the challenges of maintaining this privilege and furthering one's objectives in responding to the times that we are in at present are equally formidable. Even as we are in the midst of taking stock thus, there are also some opportunities we could use to be self-reflexive. So in my presentation today, I wish to acknowledge this forum, Women's Studies, as a space to which I belong. So it's my space, and I'm making my claims from that location. And it's in that spirit of being within and speaking that I wish to focus. One of these which I wish to focus on today is refurbishing our spaces through the labors of mentoring. There is a deep investment in characterizing mentoring as labors rather than just negotiations and mediations of power, as Anurekha Chari very painstakingly and effectively provides as what a feminist brings into the practice of sociology between mentors and mentees. Rather, these labors in line with the legacies of feminist theorizing on labor, extending the invisible and devalued labors of care that only we feminists have brought up front in our discussions of larger social reproduction in society. These spaces and institutions we have built need the very same ethical care to sustain and maintain them. And these labors have to be self-reflexively practiced. They have to be creative and inventive in handling oppositional consciousness. And I'll invoke Sharmila Rege here and a whole lot of other scholars who spoke from that sort of position, standpoint. Else we have failed in our feminism. I have personally had deep, enduring mentoring relationships with mentors at diverse stages of my student, research, and teaching careers with fantastic support and guidance, providing me deep fulfillment and direction, both from the academy and from the women's movement spaces. And it has been my endeavor to continue this practice in my own relationships, even as I come up with mixed outcomes. But I have also endured obstructions, quite damaging, and met up with lack of trust that failed to cement social relationships of meaning and build creative potential, where one chooses to exit. But that's not my focus today. Mentoring here does not just represent individual relationships of nurture, but expand to all labors that demand a sort of tectonic shift in having the courage of opening the spaces to those radical voices that are resounding around all of us, specifically today. I mean, Swati made a mention of the diversity of voices that are really, sounding themselves out, crying themselves hoarse to a state and society that is really, unattentive to it, and it's almost neglecting, cynical neglect. So courage of opening the spaces to those radical voices that are resounding all around us, of building trust, of engaged listening and learning, of not dismissing questions under the garb of ageism. Mentoring can thereby not just encourage new knowledges to enter and enrich, but also new voices that represent invisible legacies, missing voices, excluded bodies. And this renewed practice of mentoring ought not to just inhabit our spaces of teaching and learning, but our associated activities, such as this one. I mean, this workshop is tremendous in that aspect, as well as publishing and other academic and political labors that we do. Thus, mentoring here expands into the response of institutional practices, not just individual predilections. And mentoring also not through different positionings as teachers and students, but as colleagues situated in similar positionings while possessing the advantages of age and experience. And this latter is crucial if we have to have collectives nurtured, collective theorizing, collective praxis. Else we fall into the same neoliberal trap of nurturing individualism that we point to and that others around us are succumbing to today. So these microstructures and practices are what sustain not just our epistemic inquiries, but our political expressions. So what are these processes of institutionalization and which spaces can it inform, in what circumstances and with what prevailing challenges? So while today I may not have a space to explore all of them, I will just speak about a couple of them and sort of come to a discussion. Within women's studies, we consider two levels of spaces. One of producing knowledge to be the pedagogical process within the classrooms of the women's studies centers, within university spaces, the research processes through which dyads or teams operate. And second, the community we have of knowledge production, the associated spaces such as our own today, networks, manifesting itself through conferences, seminars, workshops, and now an archive. So I acknowledge Veena's role in setting up the archive at the research center, all in the hope of archiving these processes and material. Sharmila Rege has documented in detail the practice of women's studies in her essay, very, very important essay. And it's a very resourceful essay written in honor of Uma Chakravarti, where she acknowledges the mentoring relationships, but also speaks with pride of the institutional structures that we have built up over the years, of not just the centers, which where caste emerges as a force to reckon with, but the spaces where larger connections are made through other institutional structures, such as our association, regional workshops, etc. The women's studies classroom today, most of them through expansions in curriculum, Swati mentioned, have begun the practice of bringing our feminist sensibilities and politics to infuse the practice and theory of everyday knowledge production that we are engaged in. At least at the level of the students and our own research, we have tried to bring in diversity of voices and experiences through the practices of institutional reservations. This we practice even as we engage with the challenge of dealing with funding and the diktats of university authorities. And Nirmala sort of brought that out as well. Queer experiences of gender and sexual discrimination, discussions on communalization of society, the need to resist capitalist onslaught on educational opportunities have entered our feminist classrooms. But despite our efforts, other significant institutionalized inequalities continue to persist and remain within higher educational institutions. As Jenny Rovina notes, at a time when young Dalit Bahujan scholars are making it to the portals of higher education, and Swati echoed that, and beginning to write their own history, the doors seem to slam shut or spaces wind up due to the pressures of privatization, the onslaught of right-wing forces, and the pressures of seeking employment. It is precisely at such moments that our spaces need to open up, not just as support structures, but spaces of representation as well. Some such examples abound, I'm not discounting that, but we desperately need more. While the Women's Studies Centers have more or less responded, and here I do not speak for all the 160 odd that dot our higher education landscape, but those who've attempted, I would say, to practice the labor of mentoring, so that the exclusions otherwise prevalent in society based on caste, religion, are slowly sought to be addressed and discussed. But the question is also to have this resonated in our associational structures. And let me tell you, our association has not been behind in these practices, comprising not just those from the Feminist Academy, but movement spaces too. Our association has done commendably well, whether at conferences and regional workshops, we have addressed and had speakers, researchers, and publications, just to name a few. You know, the panel in Gujarat, on Gujarat in the Bhubaneswar conference, and where scholars and activists with disabilities raised question at the Goa conference, we took on the criticism self-reflexively. It is one thing to have those speaking differently and asking different questions being invited to engage in platforms to speak and have their voices amplified. However, it is another matter of self-reflexive engagement to shift the institutional structures to have the embodied voices occupy those positions. The point I wish to belabor here is how far is our practice of self-reflexivity, the necessity of foregrounding the labors of mentoring alive in these spaces? Or are we also blown away by the demands as mainstream institutional association structures? I will end with such an opportunity having presented itself at the associational level. There are several strands and numerous opportunities for women's studies spaces. I would think to respond to the present moment. In the 2017 IAWS National Conference at Chennai had one such moment. The conference itself was drowned in the larger political tumult of the location, where the Jallikattu controversy in Tamil Nadu had the Marina Beach just opposite the university premises where the conference was being held, occupied by a sea of protesters, bringing the entire city, especially those parts, out of access. Nevertheless, the organizing committee, the executive committee, did an admirable job and salvaged the conference from the chaos around. Sessions were conducted by team coordinators and things moved to some fruition. But I will close by focusing on an opportunity that emerged during the general body meeting. Several young women's studies researchers and scholars from women's studies centers raised the issue of representation, especially of reservation of positions for the SC, ST, and other groups within the association. Subversive voices that resonate with hope. Oppositional consciousness that is much needed as a dialectics for the present times. I would see these resonating with the earlier reference to the opportunities of writing one's own histories by Dalit Bahujan communities. It's a crucial moment to reckon with, especially now that caste patriarchy is vehemently rearing its head under the persistent exclusions practiced in the guise of nation building. The moment offered itself the opportunities for us to be self-reflexive, to engage in self-interrogation of our sustained exclusions in mentoring our institutional spaces. May we dwell on them in this current moment, which, as we see, has offered us, even as the pandemic, an epistemic window. I agree this is very challenging, but can only be generated by trust and the labor of time. But I think the time to trust and labor is now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meena. And before I throw the floor open for discussion, I need to draw together some of the points made. By and large, the focus has been, to begin with, on some of the crises that face state universities in Maharashtra. Shaila, I'm very happy that you have moved ahead and been able to put yourself in a very strong location, because I do know the hard work you have put in. But also, one of the foundational reasons for initiating women's studies program in the university system was so that we don't forget our histories. And I may correct you a little by pointing out that where women's studies actually began, RCWS has a long history beginning from 1974 onwards. And because of the many of the crises that Nirmala Jadhav has also pointed out, and Swati has pointed out, they have had tremendous struggle, and I would like to appreciate the role of both Putul Sathe and Vatsala Shukla in continuing the struggle despite insurmountable hardships. And I would like to also point to some of the dynamics of the classroom, which Swati has pointed out and Nirmala have pointed out. These are also very, very key positions and discussions which has haunted women's studies. One of them is, do we need to be a center or a department. Both these positions are not as simple as we assume, for the simple reason to become being a center gives a certain kind of freedom to women's studies. But since the 9th plan onwards, the demand to constitute women's studies into a department rose, primarily because of employment requirements, and because, especially in Maharashtra, for instance, the question which came up is, because teaching faculty positions were granted only on the basis of teaching hours, the number of teaching hours. And this, I think, was the situation of many state-run universities. And many of the universities across South India, for instance, have
going to Georgia. What we can say.
Am I talking to someone? Many of the universities, because we have done this exercise repeatedly for the UGC, in the last one when I was there was in 2005, and some of the reviews that we undertook points out the very question of survival makes them integrate technical education into the university system. And this has been a contentious issue discussed ad nauseum over and over again within IAWS, as well as in UGC standing committees, at least until the present government. Meena and Nirmala and Swati, I'm deeply grateful to you for opening up complex theoretical frameworks about allocation and the positive ways in which you are addressing the crisis. Teaching women's studies is definitely not as easy as we think, because one thing is we are also within a university space which has the requirements of assessment and following of certain rules of engagement with students. And this is what limits us in our teaching when we are brought under a faculty. Because in this particular space, it excludes a lot of other theorizing and alternative ways in which we could engage across disciplines. So that is one of the problems that we need to address. Again, does opening up women's studies as an academic discipline bring in a whole lot of people apart from the original vision of women's studies within the university system? And will it precise it? And this is a question which I'm posing, which Meena has also addressed to an extent, is because of the insidious ways in which political conservatism is currently eroding all institutions of higher education. And while we stress the open secular spaces across disciplines, we also need to consider, are ideas becoming polemical? Are our political positions becoming very rigid? And are we speaking as from one fixed positions, or are we willing to engage in multiple dimensions of discourse? And the reason why we are saying this is because of the right-wing ideologies, which have serious implications for women's studies. And that given that women's studies is an interdisciplinary and a transdisciplinary frame, how do we prevent the entry of certain forms of regressive, particularly damaging kinds of discourse within women's studies? And frankly, the resolution of this question is not as easy as we say, neither strategically or theoretically, because the strategic difficulty of spearheading a homogeneous feminist position comes about because of women from diverse political affiliations, feminists, have entered into the studies. And we also need to understand the politics of the university structures. Some of us might be in privileged positions, but not all universities are in such, because right-winged political elite have very strategically placed certain right-winged conservative women in the helm of affairs. So within such conflicting positions, the very survival of women's studies centers are under threat. And this becomes particularly apparent within a extremely male-dominated university, a structure which is prevailing across the country, where we do see that there is a certain denigration of women's studies, not acknowledging the need for certain commitments and the assumption that any woman can become a women's studies director. The lack of the temporality, the temporary spaces which women's studies centers occupy is another threat. And more importantly, as we reach out to, because the original agenda of women's studies centers was in demystifying knowledge. It was intended as a tool to break the academic isolation from the grassroots movements. But the pressures of reaching out to certain imagined theoretical acceptance of intellectual locations places an enormous pressure, particularly given that women's studies centers are temporary, and the sheer load placed on women's studies centers is such they are expected to be just about everywhere where women's studies is concerned. Teaching, research, extension, it's an enormous burden. If women's studies teachers are taking up, if women's studies have become teaching departments, I think the pressure to be engaging in community development and outreach programs should be rethought, because in the name of women's studies teachers are carrying an enormous burden. They get burnt out. And to come back to my position, are we trying to reach certain westernized paradigms, male paradigms of disciplinary standards, which exclude a lot of people? Then again, and defeat the original political ideology of women's studies of breaking academic isolations and reaching out to people from across, academic forums to the grassroots communities. How do we create an inclusive intellectual space that allows for theorizing, not just within the university space, but also from the ground level? And the capacity, Meena has also pointed out, the capacity to intellectualize and collectivize knowledge is something that we need to stress continuously. I now open the forum for, I think, how much time do we have?
We don't have much time, Veena, actually. We are running
Is there any quick, one or two quick questions?
Yeah, one or two quick questions here. So Vatsala can, or you can check the chat box.
Okay, the Vatsala.
Or I can read. I have.
Please do that.
I have prepared a word note, so I'll just read. There are a couple of questions which some of the participants have raised. So Anita has written that, can you further highlight a particular area? I mean, this is with regard to Professor Shaila D'Souza.
Yeah, okay. There are two questions from Anita and Bhumika. If I may, with permission from the chair. So Women's Studies Centers have, ever since the inception, been doing research on social realities. We've been looking at, in all the centers, we have data that is being used by governments. Many of us have been involved with national kind of programs like situation analysis reports. A lot of the data from Women's Studies Centers are being used in terms of public policy formation. Some of us are involved in bigger ways with the functioning of departments of women and child, or with the commissions. We are already engaging in contributing to public policy. So maybe in many ways. So through our research and extension work. And I think we need to tap on that and develop that. With regards to Bhumika's question about how do we increase the number of students, it's a tragedy that you're being paid less for having less students, because I do think that whether or not you have few students or large number of students, the effort to teach is more or less the same. Maybe in evaluation you have a little less time, but I think the effort, for example, online, we don't know how many students are attending each lecture. You can have like today 78 people listen to you, and you can have one person listen to you. So the way you're remunerated shouldn't be based on the number of students. But yes, it's an issue that many women's studies centers face. And one of the things that I can tell you what we do is that at the end of every year, we interact with the third year students of the bachelor's programs cross disciplines. And we have instituted things like purple campaigns, where we actually go to the colleges and get them thinking on gender issues. And we do draw our students from there. We have in March, celebrating International Women's Day, we do have a lot of programs for third year students so that we try and pull them into our MA program. It's a slow process. I do have a lot of hope in terms of building this, but I once again reiterate that the moment there is this, people see women's studies as being leading up to bettering their career prospects, whether it is in terms of research or employment, I think we can see a sea change in the number of students who register for our programs.
Is that all? Is there time for more questions, Vatsala?
Ma'am, there is only one question which has already been taken and discussed by Professor Swati and Professor Meena as well, by Dr. Meera Velayudhan, regarding the diversity of student coming to WSC, diversity of teaching staff, and the issue of language. And she asked, how do you address it? And then again, she talks about that how to build support and alliances with other disciplines, the interdisciplinary knowledge creation. I guess these are the eminent issues which have been taken up by Swati, and if we have some other things to add on it, I think they can quickly.
I thank each one of the speakers. Are we to close the session?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. We have to move to the second.
I thank each and every one of the participants present here and the keen insights which they have brought into women's studies, this discussion on women's studies, particularly the fact that you have used this forum not just as a space to air your grievances ad nauseum, which is something that we have lived with not just from today, but for the past 4 decades since women's studies came into existence. But more importantly, to raise questions about the pedagogic principles, the teaching of women's studies, and what it means within the theoretical framework. How does women's studies engage across disciplinary boundaries and network with grassroots movement, which is an extremely important thing, because women's studies ultimately is not just a body of knowledge, but it is political. And the difference between women's studies scholarship and perhaps many of the mainstream discipline is that we acknowledge a political location. It's very important for us to acknowledge a political location and also recognize that secularism cannot be wished away. You know, uh, although from a very postmodernist position, we could perhaps argue away the foundations of an ideology like secularism, and yet from a standpoint of women and our particular location, we just need to affirm it and fight unpopular battles. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Veena Punacha.
Thank you.
To all panelists of session 1. This was really a very enriching session with raising many voices, questions, concerns, and what exactly is women's studies and how we can move ahead. So there are many questions, and we have to keep on, discussing and deliberating on it. Now, as we move to the second session of Western Regional Conference, the theme for the second session, the theme for this panel discussion is COVID-19 as an epistemic window. The esteemed panelists for this session include the child rights activist Teesta Setalvad, Professor Sujata Patel, distinguished professor, Professor Kalpana Kannibaran, and the session is moderated by Dr. Kiran Moge. I extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished speaker. I truly feel privileged to introduce such senior scholars briefly. I begin with Teesta Setalvad, child rights activist and journalist. She is the Secretary of Citizens for Justice and Peace, an organization formed to fight for justice for the victims of 2002 Gujarat riots. Teesta Setalvad is a staunch feminist and campaigns for rights and privileges of Dalits, Muslims, and women. Teesta is an official spokesperson of Sabarang Communications, which fights for human rights. She heads the Mumbai-based NGO Citizens for Justice and Peace, CJP. She is one of the founders of Women in Media Committee. The group seeks to bring together working women journalists to raise job-related concerns and awareness of gender sensitivity in writing and reporting on issues concerning women. She is one of the founding members of Journalists Against Communalism. Apart from the journalist task, Teesta Setalvad leads the project Khoj, Education for a Pluralistic India. I welcome child rights activist Teesta Setalvad. Our second speaker for this session is Professor Sujata Patel. Professor Sujata Patel has PhD in sociology from JNU, Delhi. She was professor and head of sociology department of Savitribai Phule, Pune University, Osmania University, Hyderabad, and currently distinguished professor, CPPU. She is the author of several books. She has contributed immensely towards the development of diverse sociological traditions. Some of her important work include urban studies, readers in sociology and social anthropology, Bombay and Mumbai, the city in transition, thinking social science in India, and Bombay mosaic of modern culture, to name a few. I welcome Professor Sujata Patel. Our third speaker for this session is Professor Kalpana Kannibaran. Professor Kalpana Kannibaran has done her PhD in sociology from JNU Delhi. She is currently the director at the Council for Social Development, Southern Regional Center, Hyderabad. She is also a co-founder of the Asmita Resource Center for Women, a women's rights group. She is a prolific writer and public intellectual. She has to her credit many edited books and volumes. To name some of her important books include Women and Law, Critical Feminist Perspectives, Violence of Normal Times, Essays on Women's Lived Realities. She has also co-edited the book Challenging the Rules of Law, Colonialism, Criminology, and Human Rights in India. Her most recent book is Tools of Justice, Non-Discrimination, and the Indian Constitution. In addition to this, she has compiled and edited 2 successive NGO alternative reports on CEDAW for the National Alliance of Women India. I welcome Professor Kanna Kannivaran. The moderator for this session is Dr. Kiran Moge. Kiran Moge did her master's in economics from the London School of Economics and Political Science. She is an executive committee member of IAWS and editor of IAWS newsletter from 2017 to 2020. She's been active in All India Democratic Women's Association for over 3 decades. She's president of the Pune Zilla Ghar Kamgar Sangatna. Her articles on women in informal sector have been published in EPW, InfoChange, Equality. For past 2 decades, Kiran has made valuable contribution towards PAN Maharashtra, a progressive network organization, Sri Mukti Andolan Sampark Samiti, in which activists, researchers, journalists, academicians share experiences and action strategies for socio-political interventions. I welcome Dr. Kiran Moge. Now over to Kiran Moge.
Thank you, Vatsala. And I welcome all of you to what I think is a very critical and important panel titled COVID-19 as an Epistemic Window in this Western Regional Conference with an overarching theme of gender and I'm saying it is critical as a theme, and I'm thankful to Dr. Sujata Patel, who is one of our eminent panelists today, for actually providing us with the idea and, in a sense, the title. We often, when we are talking about gender perspectives, I think we often use this cliche, looking at something through women's eyes, and now it's, of course, women and other genders as well. And I think what, in a sense, we need to do is look at the manner in which the COVID pandemic has affected women in a myriad of ways. I mean, for us, in studies and in the women's movement, perhaps they're all visible to us. Whether it's those migrant women who walked that marathon in the month of May, or whether it is domestic workers or construction workers who got laid off as the economy got down, or whether it's those ASHA workers who worked tirelessly throughout the pandemic, visiting people's houses at a pittance with absolutely no protective gear, or whether it is all those women who faced domestic violence as they were locked down in their house, or whether it is those transgenders who lost their livelihoods and actually faced starvation in the process. The point is that all of them have actually been invisibilized in a sense, I think, by both the state, especially in terms of state policy, but not just by the state, I do believe even by society at large. And I think that as working in the area of women's studies, we need to do what women's studies has always done, which is to kind of tease out all these different aspects and bring them to the fore. But of course, we're not just talking about the experiences that women faced during the pandemic, but we're also looking at the manner in which the state has used the pandemic. And it has used the pandemic to unleash an unprecedented kind of repression against activists, whether it was those who were involved in the earlier student movements across campuses in the country, whether it is in the so-called Bhima Koregazi case, or whether it is against the large number of people who were involved in the protests against the CAA and the NRC, etc. And I'm not going into those details because I'm sure all our panelists are going to be speaking and touching upon these issues. But I think we need, we have to bring on these issues, bring them to the fore. And along with that, the manner in which the state has again used the facade of the pandemic to unleash a huge attack on the peasants and workers in this country, of whom women are a very large and again invisible part. So whether it's the labor codes that were pushed through parliament, or whether it's those anti-farmers bills that were equally run through parliament, I think, and the impact that all of that and other economic measures that this government has taken, and the completely pro-corporate policies that it has pursued so relentlessly in the last few months, I think the impact that it is having on ordinary people and women and transgenders, etc., needs to be brought out. And what I want to say here is that we have to understand that all this is being done using the constitutional framework and using the very institutions that have been set up by our constitution, whether it is parliament, so using your brute majority in parliament without any without paying any attention to the fact that you need to have a discussion, whether it is the use of the courts and the judiciary, as we are seeing now in several cases that are coming in front of us, but it is also the other institutions like the Election Commission or the Reserve Bank of India for that matter, or even some of the investigative agencies, which are all being used by this extremely right-wing state, right-wing in all senses of the word, economic, social, political, to push through its own agenda. And I think these are the things that we have to, keep in mind as we have this discussion. And therefore, I think it is, not a coincidence, I suppose, in a way, that we are having this discussion today on the 25th of November, when tomorrow is the 26th. And 26th of November, as we all know, is now commemorated in our country as a Constitution Day, a day on which Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, as the chairperson of the drafting committee, actually presented the draft of the Constitution to the Constituent Assembly, 26th of November 1949, and is also the day that the trade unions and the peasants' organizations, in an unprecedented show of unity, have called for a national strike to draw attention to these very issues that we are talking about. And so I just like to end, because I know that our speakers are going to be elaborating more on this, by drawing attention to the points that Dr. Ambedkar made in that speech, and three significant things that he said that day. The first point that he made, that we should not be content with the fact that we are a political democracy, but that without social democracy, that political democracy had actually no value. The second, that the unequal economic and social structure in which we have brought about political democracy, where we have one vote equals one value, but actually in practice, the social and economic inequalities deny that one vote, one value principle, and which he pointed out to us at that particular time. And I think the most important point that he made, that a constitution in bad hands, a good constitution in bad hands, can wreak havoc. And I think, in a sense, he warned that the manner in which this particular state is actually pushing through its agenda using these constitutional frameworks, is something that is of deep concern to us. And I hope that our eminent speakers today will throw light upon this. So without taking more of your time, I would call one by one. I think we are running a bit short of time, so I would request all of them to confine themselves to 15 minutes, And I hope that as a chair, I've not called upon to stop you, because I'm sure that you will all be saying very, very important things. I would invite first Tetalwad. All of them have been introduced to you in great detail by Vatsala, but of course, I think that neither Teesta nor Kalpana nor Sujata Patel need actually any introduction. So over to you, Teesta, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me at this very critical discussion. I'm also happy to be on the same panel with persons one is hugely respected and we're also dear friends. You know, I don't think it's possible to look at the subject has been very well put, you know, pandemic as an epistemic window, but interrogating the citizenship crisis. But I think it's very important that we look at this and situate the discussions in the pre-pandemic state and then see how much it has gotten much more acute thereafter. And I just like to put forward a few pointers, which is that we've seen, particularly post-2014, a particularly majoritarian regressive regime, which is not to say we didn't have regressive laws being enacted before. Because like I've been saying for the last 6 months, 7 months, that the amendments to the UAPA actually came in 2004, 2008, during UPA 1 and 2, and we can't forget that. However, the increasing sort of clampdown with a kind of electoral majoritarianism has been very, very visible. And I remember talking about this in the KG Kannavaran lectures in 2017. But however, what we've seen in the last 8-9 months is as if the schisms and the chasms that have been thrown up by the gross inequalities caused by this majoritarianism have just gotten sharper. And so sharp that this government seems to have opened a kind of a war, multiple war on different sections of the Indian people. So, I mean, feminism prides itself rightly in its ability to as was referred to by Kiran, to prize open the intersectionalities, to prize open what is not normally visible to different sections. So yes, apart from what we know has happened to migrant women workers and the domestic violence scenario within the COVID pandemic enforced lockdown, I think what we also need to see is that where you have a full-blown assault on citizenship, particularly in a state like Assam, where the Supreme Court mechanism has been used to completely cause a civil death to millions of people, the COVID pandemic period was also used. Assam Border Police sent notices through WhatsApp. The floods did not deter the authorities, and the entire citizenship conundrum that has enveloped that state, particularly since 2013, only gotten worse. I mean, our general economic inequalities in India are something that should really shock us. If if in 2017, 73% of the new wealth generated in the country went to the top 1%, and in the year 2000, India had 9 billionaires. By 2018, we have 119 billionaires. And a female domestic worker in India will take 22,277 years to earn what a chief executive officer of a top technology firm earns in 1 year. So I think we need to also position some of our, our formulations as feminists and as women's studies in the gross economic inequalities that are being made to grow with the kind of economic development and the economic model that is being followed. So yes, the sex worker and her family, transgenders, women survivors of domestic violence, all of these need to be looked at, and discrimination within these sections. But I would, like to, in the first 5 minutes, first, I've already taken 3 or 4 minutes, talk about what has been happening with Adivasis and forest dwellers through the law and through forest department and police repression in the last 8 months. What has been happening, of course, with workers in labor codes has been so well mentioned by Kiran. Already we've seen 23 farm union leaders arrested today, and 23 positions in Punjab and Haryana are blocked on the eve of the strike. So even elementary democratic protest is being clamped down upon. We are likely to see more repression by tomorrow because workers, farmers, Adivasi forest dwellers have all joined the general strike that has been announced for Constitution Day. And we are seeing hate letting of a particular kind, where you're seeing media in the absolute electronic media as the arms of the government. And the hate only got worse. It's not like we didn't have it before during the pandemic, but the way we've seen electronic media channels being singularly used, particularly to demonize one section of the religious minority, particularly to demonize human rights defenders, particularly to demonize those sections of Indians who stand up for those who are marginalized, has been quite extraordinary. And one has to only look at the example of even a channel like India Today. I'm deliberately not using Z News or Republic, but India Today runs a campaign for virtually 17 days on the whole Tabligh Jamaat congregation, which was held in mid-March 2020, not asking the question that the Delhi police under the Ministry of Home Affairs, which has given permission, not interrogating who gave the permission and why it was given, but the fact that singling out this congregation, not looking at Namaste Trump, not looking at other religious congregation, so much so that the super spreader epithet was linked in the public Hindi belt mind against the average Muslim. And we've seen discrimination in Banaras, Lucknow, Rampur, where chota shops and thelas owned by Muslims have been discriminated against. And you saw young Danish even taking his life because of this in Himachal Pradesh. So we saw from the entire Kaimur belt, Sonbhadra, Bihar, Jharkhand, we saw an unleashing of the forest department, Uttarakhand, Dudhwa Forest Reserve, we saw the unleashing of the forest department trying to undermine the Forest Rights Act in these areas. Fortunately, because of organizations like the IAWS, and wherever there was organization, it was not so easy to do so, but the effort was made nevertheless. And we are really seeing a situation, as was said by the coordinator of this panel, Ms. Kiran Moge, that within the constitutional framework, we are actually seeing the onset of a majoritarian state that is functioning extremely successfully. In large measure, of course, thanks to how our courts have begun to function, particularly the constitutional courts. Some high courts have been good exceptions, but those high courts that who stood the constitutional ground have been vilified by the second most powerful law officer in the country by calling them running parallel governments, as much as journalists who covered the mass reverse migration of migrant workers were called vultures. So we are actually seeing the use of state machinery to undermine whatever principles of constitutional democracy that existed in this country, however iniquitous our situation was. I'd like to draw attention particularly because we all have limitations of time, and I certainly don't want to take over any extra time or to be reminded of that. I'm doing so to concentrate a bit on the citizenship crisis, because that is where we've been working on for a long time, for the last 3.5, 4 years, particularly in the state of Assam. I mean, we are seeing the citizenship conundrum being used as a sharp and hysterical political weapon of exclusion in Assam. We've seen the COVID pandemic period. We've seen the COVID pandemic period also not deter the authorities from issuing foreigner tribunal notices to many, many persons, particularly women living in far-flung rural areas of the state. I mean, we know, all of us know that huge numbers of people, 1.9 million, 19 lakh people were finally excluded from the NRC final list. But 1.9 million is not the story. The total population of Assam is 3.2 million. However, in the first list, it was 1.2 crores. Then it became 4.4 million. So you've seen over a period of 7 to 12 years, and 1/3 of the population of Assam caught up in the trauma of being interrogated through this ridiculous documentary test of citizenship, where despite certain modalities being agreed upon by different stakeholders under a Supreme Court monitored process, you found those very processes being undermined by executive orders, by the NRC coordinator, which were then okayed by the Supreme Court under the Chief Justice, who's today a Rajya Sabha member nominated by the ruling party. So you see a complete vilification of when we entered Assam, when Citizens for Justice and Peace started working in Assam, we started asking people that, why did you agree to this documentary test in the first place? But we had to, as human rights players, as human rights defenders, accept what had been painfully agreed upon through a consensus of 15 years by different stakeholders after the Assam movement, the Nelly massacre of 1983, February 18, that took 3,000 innocent Muslim lives. All of that led even minority groups to come to the conclusion that let there be a free and fair, tested process of citizenship. However, we saw as the processes unfurled and as the bureaucracy, the political powers started wanting to use this as a political weapon of exclusion, which it was in the first place, you found 69% of those affected are women and are rural women. 69% of those excluded either in the NRC process, and that's not the only process in Assam. For those of people who may not be so familiar with what the citizenship process is, one process of exclusion is the NRC process. The other one is the doubtful foreigner process, which is where in a pre-independence colonial law called the Foreigners Act, the Assam Border Police is authorized to issue notices which are often ill-considered, which are often without any proof, and are used to just harass an unlettered working class population. Then comes the de-voter process, unleashed in 96-97 by a Chief Election Commissioner regime of T.N. Seshan, where lower level officials of the Election Commission have been issuing de-voter notices, which is doubtful voter notices to families and individuals in Assam. A total of 2.2 million people in Assam and their families today reel under this consistent trauma and burden. We've had over 108 deaths, 95 of them being suicides, and the state itself has spent 1,600 crores in this process, which is even now not accepted by the ruling party. Because once they got the results of 1.9 million last year, now you have the ruling party say that we are not happy, this is not enough. Because right through the 80s and 1980s and 1990s, a bogey of migration, who are the Guspetias, who are the immigrants, was created. When mythical figures were thrown around of large numbers of people, there was that Sinha report, there were other figures thrown out. None of this was tested through data, through hard data. And therefore, even the Supreme Court in Sarbananda Sonowal, 2005 and 2007, laid down certain precepts which are extremely problematic vis-a-vis citizenship. So we've seen the concept of composite Indian nationhood and equality of class, caste, religion, gender in citizenship being thwarted at its core in the state of Assam. And then comes December 2019, where the Citizenship Amendment Act is brought in, where you find religion as a marker for the first time being brought in for the rest of India. And then the formula is very, very simple. For this particular regime, that is undoubtedly a majoritarian regime, for many of us is a proto-fascist regime that has its design on changing the entire constitutional structure of the state. And it's very, very clear what they want to do through this. That yes, you have the CAA 2019 in place, where from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and you allow all refugees, or you allow refugees to have a shorter span for applying for registration of citizenship, whereas any who are non-Muslim, all non-Muslims who are from these countries are given preferential registration of citizenship. Muslims from these countries, atheists from these countries, Ahmadiyas from these countries, whether they regard themselves as Muslim or not, of course are not regarded. Countries like Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Nepal, also our neighbors, are excluded from this particular amendment. So there's a clear discriminatory tone in this entire amendment. Therefore, once this amendment comes, and with the experience of Assam behind us, Muslims in India are very, very clear that this is meant to actually target their very existence. And therefore, you see an amazing spurt of protests all over the country, beginning from Aligarh and Jamia on December 15, spreading all over, inspiring protests everywhere, including my state. And then you find the Delhi elections coming, and suddenly the political class from the ruling party trying to use the elections to demonize the protesters. The Home Minister stating in Parliament that actually the chronology is what he wants it to be. And finally, it is in that scenario that the pandemic lockdown is called. And shockingly, the pandemic lockdown is used to further demonize the protesters. A draconian law like UAPA is used to target young protesters, new emerging leaders, etc. And the fear should be, for all of us concerned with democratic principles and democratic practices, that the fear and insecurity caused by the COVID pandemic is likely to create a situation where the state will make many of these lockdown parameters as normal. I just want to point to the fact that almost permanent 144 section exists in cities like Mumbai, Ahmedabad, Delhi, Kolkata, Chennai. Very, very few places are allowed to us for normal democratic protests. We've seen the difficulties we face in Mumbai with Mumbai Bagh, etc. This is going to only get worse because whichever government it is, whether it is the ruling party, the center or others, they will want to take advantage of the unusual fear-like situation created, insecure situation created during the lockdown. And therefore, it's going to require a lot of ingenuity on the part of not just feminists and women's studies academics, but all democratic-minded Indians to figure out a way to regroup, to figure out a way to reassert democratic ideals, to creatively render our protests live and kicking. And I just want to end my thing by just paying a tribute to my team in Assam, because we've got about 7,000 volunteers working there. And I cannot tell you with what zeal the team Assam is working. I mean, even today I get a message that here is a woman from an unlettered woman from a rural village, served a foreigner's notice simply because the spelling, the Assam Border Police spelled the name of a village wrongly. So she's asked to, in double jeopardy, to revisit the foreigners' tribunals. And our team spent 10 days interacting with the police to convince them that this notice should be withdrawn. It is withdrawn. And 5 days later, she served the notice all over again. So I think what we are really seeing is weaponizing of the bureaucracy and the police in a way not so far happened in the rest of the country, as Assam has seen. And the functioning of the foreigners' tribunals is something that we are studying. We are just undertaking a study of 1,500 foreigner tribunal orders. And what we have found from our preliminary analysis, which we are now deepening, I just would like to share with this esteemed gathering, that our CDP study of these 1,500 foreigner tribunal judgments, more minorities, both religious and linguistic, were tried, as well as a greater proportion of them were declared foreigners as compared to Hindus. The linguistic minority were identified as Bengalis for speaking Bangla. 75% of FT orders were issued ex parte, without the individual being present. For some FTs, this rate was 100% of all the cases that was heard by it. The police investigation that formed the basis of the complaint often appeared botched, superficial, and biased. Some individuals who proven their citizenship as Indian received fresh summons from the same, violating the principles of double jeopardy. Procedural flaws such as inconsistent evidentiary standard and procedural law was common, notable through judges in different FTs taking differing views on documents to be produced, contents of statements, and time available to present witnesses. Clerical errors in age or spellings of names were deliberately overlooked by some FTs on the basis of verbal explanations, while other FTs relied on such errors to declare people foreigners. This is very important as far as the 69% of women in Assam are concerned. Common usage of terms such as projected father and projected mother, lacking in legal clarity, were adopted by foreigners' tribunals and widely used with respect to family members of persons before the FTs, causing humiliation and trauma during open hearings. Foreigners' tribunals in Assam, I have been to them, are not like even the NGT or any other tribunal set up under constitutional norms 323 of the Constitution. These are closed areas. Just the person accused of being not being an Indian is allowed there with her or his lawyer. Family members are not allowed inside. Media is not allowed inside. Friends are not allowed inside. So there is no independent scrutiny of what is happening within the precincts of foreigners' tribunals. Foreigners' tribunals function under a pre-independence colonial 1946 Foreigners Act. Under Section 9 of that law, the burden of proof of me proving myself to be an Indian lies with me if I'm accused of being a foreigner, which means there's no burden on the state. There's a reversal of burden of proof. And this makes the whole task extremely onerous and difficult. The Gaon Bara certificate, which was a document that was allowed for women, because women are often married early in rural settings. Their names, as they enter the first voters list, are post-marriage. The Gaon Bara certificate, which is in a collective affirmation by the village where she is born, to say, yes, this girl was born here, was agreed in the SOPs of the NRC, but the Supreme Court itself neutralized that at a later point. It's been a hellish job for us to even understand the kind of deliberate procedural flaws created by this entire citizenship recognition process. And I'll just end up by saying, because my time is up, that what does it mean to deny woman, man, child? And we've got an order from the Supreme Court at the moment that no child will be sent to a detention camp. What does it mean for a woman, child, transgender? There are 20,000 transgenders who are in the NRC list to be denied a citizenship. It's like a civil death. No welfare schemes, no voting, no jobs, and possibly loss of whatever little holdings that you might have. Thank you.
Very much, Tista, for that very, very moving, I would say, indictment of the government and what it has been doing secretly, I would say, or not so secretly in Assam. I'm sure we'll come back to many of the points that you have raised, but I would now request Professor Biren to kindly take over. Thank you. Kalpana there.
So the next, next speaker for this session is Professor Sujata Patel. I request Professor Sujata Patel.
No, it's Kalpana and then Sujata Patel.
Yeah.
I thought it was Sujata. I was waiting for Sujata. I'm sorry, I lost your voice at that point.
Oh, okay, never mind. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Kiran. I'm sorry about that mix-up. I kind of assumed it was Sujata. And thank you to the IAWS Western Regional team for this invitation. I will focus, I think Tista's made a good beginning with, for me, with speaking about the NRC. Part of what I will look at is the question of carcerality. So in speaking of COVID-19 citizenship and the place of gender, and in looking at the pandemic context, we need first to cut through the universalizing discourse on COVID-19 as affecting humanity at large, to looking at with greater care at the interlocking marginalities that exacerbate vulnerabilities and suffering. Arguing that there are 2 or 3 pandemics with shadow pandemics disaggregates realities of cumulative discrimination, denying unequal distribution of aggravated harms. We witnessed the painful demonstration of this in the death trails of workers fleeing hostile work environments to return to the place they call home, the villages they have homes in. And yet it is this very journey home that is rendered precarious, trapping them between the camp and the necropolis. Surveillance is the norm, not disease surveillance, but policing and checkposts to keep the poor in carceral facilities. Those that leave die painful deaths. 12-year-old Jamalo Madakam, who walked 100 kilometers from the chili farms in Telangana to her village in Chhattisgarh and died of exhaustion before she reached her village. 16 workers run over by a train in Aurangabad, 20 workers killed in a truck crash in Madhya Pradesh, and more. Recalling them each is a difficult exercise, not only for the agoraphobia it binds us in, but also because there are so many of these instances of direct injustice that we have begun to rapidly lose count of the numbers of workers, the numbers on the move, the numbers that have walked to their deaths, all in search of this place called home that will offer refuge, dignity, security, and privacy, survival importantly, rescuing them from the degradations and the depredations of the cumulative oppression dispossession, and inhumanity that we witnessed during the pandemic. The deep paradox lies embedded in the structural violence that marks lives in the borderlands, where there is neither sustenance in the home nor in the work site, and the roads that connect the two are disappeared by the state. We can scarcely forget the large numbers of women who migrate on their own and with families in search of work. Among those who trek back to their villages were large swathes of these women. Are we to believe, asks Indu Agnihotri, that these journeys were undertaken or completed without myriad forms of violence being perpetrated on and against those trudging long distances to reach their homes? It is crucial in this context to remember, as she urges us to do, that the long march back for crores of migrant workers was a march to homes that would need to be stitched and strung together from the debris of failed crops, unpaid loans, unfulfilled promises of love, life, and caring to near and dear ones across rural India. Brahma Prakash offers us similar insights. Why did these workers leave home in the first place? The term social distancing has acquired a new global currency in the context of COVID-19. A wide-ranging debate in India focuses on untouchability practices and viralities of the Hindu caste order that make this term dangerous in its potential to disrupt carefully crafted constitutional conversations and practices around Article 17 and the ban on untouchability, as also the treatment of Muslims in India. We have seen on the ground, both in the cases of deaths of workers recounted above, not from COVID-19 infection, but from COVID-19 dispossession, and in the Islamophobic rants on media and by governments on COVID-19 contagion in Muslim garb, speech that the Supreme Court refused to declare as incitement to hate. We need to understand the meanings of lockdown in India in its supremacist sense: segregation, social, economic, and governance boycott, all specifically proscribed under the Constitution of India. There is also embedded in the heteronormative politics of locking down a locking out and dispossession of Dalits, Adivasis, and Muslims, and an erasure of the queer experience of lockdown, literally and metaphorically, with performative banding together, reproducing bias, exclusion, and violence in every realm. It is this aspect of the lockdown that is disproportionate, unstated in a casteless discourse that is deeply discriminatory precisely because of this discursive erasure of the specificities of suffering, dispossession, and harm. It is also no accident that aggravated state violence, carceral governance, and the refusal of the state to exercise due diligence in preventing genocidal speech has targeted the very communities that are invisibilized through the prime ministerial reference to we the people and the preamble during the lockdown. Courts, corralled into this enclosure, can only produce what I call COVID-19 jurisprudence. Carcerality is fundamental to this politics, governance, and jurisprudence. COVID-19 provides the opportunity for a halting, ambivalent jurisprudence of rights under the Constitution, as also constitutional insurgency by a very thin sliver of a dissenting judiciary to save the moral domains of the Constitution and its futures. Notwithstanding the rescue efforts, it is my argument that the banding together of state and state-sanctioned action, legislation in the veil of legality like the UAPA, hidden behind the veil of sovereignty and courtly moves, co-constitute this terrain of COVID jurisprudence. How do gender, caste, and majoritarianism interlock in the context of a pandemic to produce deaths en masse in ways that directly mock the right to life, dignity, livelihood, equality, and non-discrimination, the right to self-respect, autonomy, and self-determination, and the right to the Constitution as commons? Sheila Jasanoff poses pertinent questions and underscores the importance of a cross-cultural understanding. What is a life worth saving, she asks. The juridicalization of fundamental freedoms fuels regimes of enclosure. While workers were being flung out, the pandemic continued to rage. So did carceral politics and carceral governance. The quarantining under police surveillance has been disastrous in terms of our collective experience of human dignity. If spraying bleach on returning workers was at one end of a theater of horrors, at the other end was custodial violence, sexual assault, torture, and murder. Carceral governance has been seamless in the present time. Araria, Bhima Koregaon, anti-CAA resistors, Vikas Yadav, Jayarajan Benix in Thuthukudi, caste atrocity in Hathras, for example, facilitated by judicial equivocation and dissociation with halting reliefs that do not add up to any substantive measure of justice. The reliefs sought in such a situation shrink to the minimal. Provide food and free rations, provide shelter, provide free transport, citizens beseeching an abdicating state for crumbs while the courts look on. This is the bulwark of COVID-19 jurisprudence. The debates on the gender implications of COVID-19 are shrouded in constructions of the shadow pandemic that the lockdown has, and I put the shadow pandemic in quotes, that the lockdown has triggered for a range of vulnerable actors along the periphery. Isha Ray recalls how the gender division of labor and the necessary coping of scarce water supplies brings into question new kinds of inequalities inherent in the seemingly neutral demand to the 6-step rule that is demanded by this pandemic. The pandemic, she reminds us, stratifies even when it kills equally. COVID-19 might not differentiate between prince and pauper, to quote her, but running water does. These divisions of household labor have implications across the class hierarchy, of course, worries about care work and housework being done by women, and how the invisibility is likely to get dismissed anew during this pandemic. But they are especially harmful when they offer legitimate logic of public health to reinforce historic notions of cleanliness, untouchability, and risk of pollution. The implications of these are likely to be unprecedented, but worse, their persistence and extent are unpredictable, especially as impunity marks the rhetoric and rule of our leaders today. The rhetorical appropriations of what the family is and who is seen as worthy of protecting not only lays out ways in which the ideal read upper caste Hindu male citizen ought to perform, it also dismantles the foundations of Baba Saheb Ambedkar's philosophy and the fundamental tenets of the Constitution. As Ambedkar pointed out, and to recall Jyotiba Phule, Ghulamgiri or slavery is now the method of rule witnessed in the treatment of workers, the working classes, and in their dispossession and reduction to conditions of servitude and bare life through the imposition of conditions of forced labor. Kiran Moge referred to the new labor codes. The shadow pandemic, in the words of Phumzile Mlambo Nkuka, director of the UN Women, is that violence against women targets women and girls locked into abusive homes, with men venting their anger at the system on intimate partners and children. There is also, however, and we need to be attentive to this, a problematic aspect of the coining of the term shadow pandemic. As Navsharan Singh points out, by identifying the trigger of domestic violence as the acute and chronic stress caused by economic insecurity, this framing of the third overlaid pandemic, that is a shadow, individualizes the structural problem that the lockdown embodies, a structural political choice that exacerbates the insecurity and suffering of women and girls in particular ways, even while men continue to suffer deep harms on account of those very structural reasons. She points out pertinently that what is labeled a shadow pandemic is in fact a second cumulative lockdown for women that renders their lives precarious, both in the private and the public domain. The impunity that is seen to reign in intimate relations is in fact one that stretches for women on a continuum from private to public, from home to work site, and highways where large numbers of women workers trek back to their villages on foot. We have had reports of increasing instances of domestic violence during lockdown and the opposition of women to reopening liquor outlets which they see as exacerbating domestic violence. And this is an old strategy right from the anti-RX struggle in Andhra. The old question of state revenues versus women's interests and security resurfaces yet again in a vastly different context of heightened vulnerabilities of a different order at the familial level. So too questions of choice and private autonomy and who is seen as the owner of such autonomy. As Ruchir Joshi reminds us, if there is violent or reprehensible alcohol-fueled behavior, surely it is the behavior that should be policed and not the alcohol. But it also does, but it does not just end with the regulation of such alcohol, or one could argue any other substance consumption, or our need to disengage it from domestic violence. It also brings along with it the questions of how we think of the private and the social, the question of responsibility, and the actors who are seen as gatekeepers of these threats and protections within them. The working woman is seen as most to blame for spreading viral disease. There were several suggestions we've seen with reference to domestic workers. There were also several suggestions to close down red light districts till the pandemic had been contained. As Shakti Natraj asks about the veracity of these attacks on behalf of an already outcast set of workers, is sex really the main risk factor for a virus spread by respiratory droplets when 17 people must live in a house with no running water to wash their hands? This is not to downplay the threat of COVID-19 to these women's lives, but only to remind ourselves that there are threats that have been multiple and omnipresent well before the pandemic, as Tista pertinently pointed out. Instead, armed with new legitimacy of a public health concern, their work is a threat that, the threat of their work is sanctionable with a renewed morality. As Natraj suggests, closing brothels is a grand and empty gesture, to use her word, that hides the state's abandonment of migrants and informal sector workers during the crisis. In a state that has pre-decided its fault lines, a pandemic that affects the most vulnerable worker must also simultaneously punish such a worker for causing the very thing they suffer as a consequence of. This just happens to be the latest iteration of how its hands get washed clean of responsibility. In the final piece of my presentation, I look at the directive of the Supreme Court on the prison complex and the place of reproductive justice in carceral governance. In relation to prisoners, judicial deliberations focused on a decongestion of prisons and testing of persons prior to arrest and provision of PPE and sanitizers inside prisons. The Supreme Court ordered the release of prisoners who had served 2 years in detention centers under the Foreigners Act in Assam with a reduced surety. But as of 12th October 2020, out of a total of 466,000 prisoners in custodial facilities across India, with Uttar Pradesh having over 1 lakh, 68,000 prisoners had been released from prisons out of 4,66,000. An assessment of women in prisons as on 20th June 2020 showed 22,000 women prisoners, of whom 10,000 were between 20 and 40 years of age. That is, over 47% were between 20 and 40 years of age. Only 1,700 women had been released in May. And I quote these figures from Pratiksha Bakshi and Navsharan Singh's recent piece. I now turn to sexual and reproductive justice. The COVID-19 pandemic is not the first time pandemic vulnerabilities and their intersection with sexual and reproductive justice has been brought before courts. We cannot help but recall NAS Foundation, which asserted the need to radically transform the law in order to ensure survival, dignity, and life of persons irrespective of gender or sexual orientation. The demand for the decriminalization of homosexuality was brought before the court in the context of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, urging the court to recognize the exceptional vulnerability faced by queer communities in India, criminalized by Section 377 IPC. arbitrary and illegal arrest and detention on the one side, access to healthcare treatment, life, liberty, and fulfillment on the other. When faced with a choice, the NAS court stood on the side of life, liberty, and dignity with the grant of full sexual and reproductive justice to all persons. On the other hand, Safura Zargar's case, like Naz, was a case of the threat to life and liberty via reproductive harms aggravated by pandemic conditions. It was neither coincidental nor accidental, nor inadvertent that Zargar was arrested when the COVID-19 lockdown had just been declared. It was also not an accident that she was arrested when she was pregnant and that she was a Muslim woman. In the Araria case, similarly, the judicial officer who charged the victim with contempt, the victim and her counselors with contempt, and sent them to custody, did it in full knowledge that this was a survivor of gang rape suffering from the profound trauma of sexual assault. The COVID-19 line then bolsters the pandemic of impunity, to use Upendra Bakshi's term, and carceral governance through lockdown jurisprudence. The cases of Araria and Safura Zargar in different ways draw the COVID-19 line, the line that separates COVID-19 jurisprudence from the pandemic jurisprudence of the NAS Foundation variety in India. To sum up, COVID-19 jurisprudence then desiccates rights, erodes the basis of the Constitution as commons, and defeats constitutionalism, acting in concert with the authoritarian Hindutva state. Although the court observed in the recent Gujarat Mazdoor Sabha case that courts adjudicate the legality of actions and are not meant to give shoulder to the administration to fire their guns from, COVID-19 jurisprudence unfortunately enables precisely this. The manner in which this pandemic has been handled is a sign of the place of we the people in the imaginary of this national government. The lockdown triggers the march of exodus constitutionalism, to echo Bakshi, that truncates citizenship, putting it out of the sphere of the Constitution as commons through the creation of the constitutional self and the constitutional other, or rather the unconstitutional other, devaluing people who have been forcibly displaced by the lockdown. The task before us, therefore, and importantly, I believe the task before a forum like the IAWS, is to resurrect our claims to birthright citizenship that draws from the wellsprings of our inherent dignity as persons under the Constitution of India and under the triadic ethical framework of the Constitution of India, and halt the march of COVID-19 jurisprudence and the march of the pandemic of impunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kalpana, for that very revealing presentation, and especially the discussion around the universality of the pandemic versus the shadow pandemics on one hand, and also the points that you have raised about carceral jurisprudence, the COVID jurisprudence, and the impact that it is having on the different sections that we are all concerned with, whether it is the Dalits, the minorities, women, the queer community, etc. These are very, very important points, and I hope that we will have time for more discussion. I would now like to call upon Dr. Sujata Patel as the last panelist. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiran, and thank you, Indian Association of Women's Studies, for inviting me to this panel, as well as the Western Regional Center for organizing this panel, because I think it has a very important implication for what we are seeing and understanding what is happening in the country and the world today. I'm also very happy to be part of the panel where both friends like Tista and Kalpana are there, and they both have elaborated in detail the ways in which the COVID-19 has
has opened up the displacement of rights for all the minorities, all the exploited, all the excluded. And their presentations has made it easier for me to present something a little bit different than what they had said. As a social theorist, I'm interested in trying to understand the larger social order that organizes the way we live and the way we reproduce ourselves. And when I mentioned earlier, and I've been talking on this for the last few months, and I must thank Putul and RCWS who first invited me to talk about this in May and then later in August, as to how does this crisis open up an epistemic window to understand what our society is all about. So I am going to speak on two concepts. Kalpana spoke on the carceral society. I'm going to speak on the risk society. And I'm going to speak why we have to think of the whole system being creating risks for all of us as individuals and as collectives. And why is it that risks, the opposite of risk, which is trust, has eroded to such an extent that everyday social relationships are displaced in today's world. And this has happened differently in different parts of the country, but it is also something that has happened across the world. So I'm going to elaborate how the question of risk and trust organize our social order, and how over the time, and I think it has happened from the 1970s and 80s onwards, but we are now understanding the implication of this in 2020. And this implication is about how everyday order of trust has broken up, and we live in a risk situation. There are two themes that I would like to discuss. The first is, and the pandemic has opened up two themes, in my opinion, for discussion. The first is life. That is, how do we stop deaths and continue to augment a healthy life and stop suffering? And the second is of the economy, that is how to generate incomes, employment, revenues, and taxes in order to upgrade life. These two themes have over the world interconnected to present to us a model of a lockdown. And as we know, over the last hundreds of years, from the time we've had plague in the 14th to 16th century, and recently the Spanish flu in the 1920s, the question of a lockdown has been the model that has been perfected during the earlier epidemics, and is related to every country, suggesting that preventive and curative health system and democratic and human governments go hand in hand with lockdown. What has happened in the case of India is that this two attribute model that we have seen that took place from 25th March is in continuation with the earlier model which Kalpana talks about, and Tista talked about, which started when the lockdown was initiated in the context of first Assam, and then in August 2000, in the case of Kashmir, because the way the lockdown was addressed in the case of India was to suggest that this lockdown was something which is not to do with health, but it has to do with law and order. So from March 25th onwards, and continuing for the next 6 weeks, while we had various kinds of lockdowns in wards and localities, in cities and districts and states, this lockdown has created a situation where it has been implemented through the Disaster Management Act of 2005, which was initially instituted because of the tsunami of 2004. It was not considered a health emergency, but it was considered a public problem of a public order. And this lockdown, therefore, intervenes to overturn all other acts and authorities and gives complete control to the state to intervene in terms of a bureaucratic command and control practices from the center to the state, and then the state to the district, and there's a hierarchization of governance. Policing, therefore, is a solution to control people rather than an entry into the health understanding of how to create a furthering of life, and the use of zealous crowd control, lathis and sticks and arrests and other forms of repression and torture in police custody, as mentioned by both Tisa and Kalpana, becomes the way the governance intervenes to organize the bodies that COVID debilitates in the context of the virus. So the lockdown I'm suggesting is a policy which has a long history, and it has been used by the present regime, which showed its majoritarian face very clearly during the Assam situation, and then into the Kashmir situation, where and this was implemented by the central government on the 25th of March, and it flowed into. And despite the fact there were different kinds of governments in various states which were not the part of the BJP government, they used the same thing, same ways of handling the problem of reconstituting and helping the bodies to become more healthier. They used it as a police and a law and order intervention of controlling the bodies. And this was based, I'm arguing, on 4 myths. And these are the myths that organized the lockdown from 25th March. The first myth was that India is an urbanized country, and that the people of India live in self-enclosed homes. As a consequence, we saw a lot of people who were on the streets, in small one-room apartments, and in various railway stations, in public places, being enclosed and pushed into roofed settlements so that they are not outside. And we saw it in various parts of towns and cities, this intervention taking place. Secondly, though the lockdown was for the entire country, the ways of organizing life in urban India, as I've just said, where most of the poor live, was not taken into account. And therefore, the lower segments of the urban population who live cheek by jowl in one-room apartments or on the streets were pushed into small living spaces. These groups then became policed for transgression of immobility, and it led to police brutality. And everyday life was just that in April and May and June. Secondly, the state created in its policy a myth that Indians have service jobs and can work from home. Rather, most workers, and particularly migrants, have stay in small shops. And once they were closed, they had lost both jobs and place to stay. And therefore, we saw a situation where they were homeless and they had no other option but to come on the streets and protest. And then there was a confrontation with the police. Thirdly, what was thought to be physical distancing was made out in the context of social distance as social distancing, and this physical distancing immobilized the upper segments of the population, the middle classes who had homes so they could isolate themselves. In India, these are very important ways in which physical distancing needs to be distinguished from social distancing, because trust networks has to, though mediated through inequities of caste, gender, religious and tribal affiliations, however, allow people to relate to each other through economic activities. And in spite of these inequalities, the nation state's policies have created a degree of faith and belief in redressal of these inequities, a trust in change of status, in ensuring aspirations for mobility. The pandemic led to a reverse journey by breaking these trust networks and legitimizing instead social distancing. Thus, upper groups actually became isolated from putting together trust networks with lower caste, class, tribal groups in terms of everyday economic activities, and physical distancing, given that these upper groups interpreted it, as Kalpana said, within caste rules, that of pollution and purity started, and this notion of purity and pollution started being applied officially and unofficially in all social interactions with lower caste and other communities, and became policed through housing societies, creating social distances among the middle classes between lower and upper castes, and simultaneously, as Tisa and Kalpana has said, push women into the household and into domestic work. More generally, it has created boundaries and borders between neighbors and groups within middle classes and slums, within localities and wards, districts and states, and across the country. And lastly, something which has not been mentioned by both Tista and Kalpana, I think the fourth myth was to suggest that tracing can be organized through technology. And therefore we had Arogya Setu within days of 25th March. In fact, it was released on 2nd of April, and contrarily, it has led to further surveillance and the problem of privacy concerns. So we have the lockdown itself created a perception of risk. And this risk was about about not having to be able to protect your body, because the outside world did not allow you to protect the body, and therefore it was part of a larger social order that suggested that organized bodies have to be isolated within the household, and that any transgression would lead to policing of it. The second risk that got articulated was related to the health system. What I'm suggesting is here that the social order itself showed a way in which the organization of both the bodies as well as the economy was presented as if they knew how to handle it. But what happened was it created further risks to both the body and the economy. So the health emergency really allows for testing and tracing and isolation and quarantine. And we have seen this happening with certain countries, but no such efforts were made for months. There is an article by Ravi Duggal in the EPW where he said that the Spanish flu allowed for the Bombay city to be able to organize ways to handle the pandemic. But those lessons were not learned by and were not remembered institutionally by the present regime, and therefore the part and there was therefore people started distrusting authorities or at all levels to be able to protect them, and sometimes allowed for migration to their own earlier to different parts of the country to be able to get resources to be able to protect their bodies. And we've seen migration to many parts of different parts where there were public hospitals where poor went to access this. So what we saw, therefore, is a health emergency which indicated an uneven regional nature of governance, and consequently, it led to an understanding that our biomedical systems, the role of big pharmas, the country's unequal public health infrastructure, the decrease of trained human resources. We had 7 doctors per 1,000 as against the global average of 1.72 per 1,000. Lack of medical equipment such as oxygen cylinders, ventilators, and decreasing health budgets. For example, again, Dougal quotes that a budget that was 35 to 40% in 1970s and 80s in BMC became 12 to 13% by the time it was 2001. So we have lessening of GDP on health. And this is again part of the way in which there is the social order is creating risks for every individual who it has to cater to. I'm presenting my argument in terms of risk and trust because it is related to the fact that citizenship is about giving trust to individuals that they can get access to everyday reproduction of life. What has happened as a consequence of COVID-19 is the recognition that not only is the government unable to do so, that it has intervened deliberately to withdraw any ways in which there would be an interface between the government and individuals and collectives which can access these ways in which life can be reproduced. The breakdown of trust, therefore, is also related to data regarding tests. And we have seen the continuous intervention of the government in knowledge production, such that today we don't know how much to trust the data regarding health statistics. This data shows that there has been decrease of number of tests and deaths, but actually, and this has been particularly so now today in Delhi and North India, the infection continues to spread and deaths are increasing. So again, we have a question about how to understand information, how to understand our ways of reproducing life in terms of information. Recently, this has led to the Department of Health to suggest that the health system has not been able to give access to any other health problem other than COVID. Immunization has dropped by 27%. Deliveries have dropped by 28%. Surgeries fell by 60%. Outpatient treatment for heart ailments and cancer has declined by 70%. and there are 51% fewer cardiac emergencies which are logged in terms of last year in the same months. So the second risk is about the health system and access to the health system. And the third risk is about, of course, the economy, because without income, it is not possible, and jobs, it is not possible to reproduce life. A study done on 11 states by 65 CSOs stated that 50% received only rations thrice, and 42% received twice, and 8% none. This situation is true much more for Jharkhand, Odisha, MP, and Bihar, where 66% did not receive cash for food and 51% did not receive medicines. Thus, a stimulus package, if we look at it, it's not oriented to people. It is oriented to enterprises. It's the criticism, and it has been criticized for having old schemes rather than new investment and into the system. And therefore, we have a situation where unemployment has increased, and even salaried employment, as CMI suggests, has declined. 21 million of salaried jobs have gone. So in the survey that I just quoted, 3/4 of the households in these 11 states, which include the most poor states, Jharkhand, Odisha, MP, Bihar, UP, 73% have expressed fear and anxiety about the future. And most of them are Dalits, that is 77%. 3/5 of the household are worried about sustained income and support of the family. And more than 1/3 have disturbed sleeping patterns, and 33% are without social interactions. There is an awareness that almost all of us, are in India, are in the informal sector, and that a large number are internal migrants, and they live mostly in urban India, almost 30 to 50%. They work in small jobs, in construction industry, in e-commerce, in hospitality industry. And they migrate and circulate between villages and cities and rotate in time cycles of 6 months to 2 years. They are recruited by labor contractors. They rent out single rooms where 4 to 5 stay together and have little to no social security. So the labor codes that have been introduced do not have any way in which this can be overturned. It is this that the social, this kind of economy and the life that this pandemic has opened up. A situation wherein most people have had to live for themselves and find difficulty to believe and trust in the continuation of their everyday life in terms of the government or the authorities that are there or the regime that is there. This is not the situation which was there in the earlier part of the time when we started the post-independence period. There was some faith in the institution. This faith allowed for movements to emerge. These movements asked, questioned, and interrogated the state to ensure that welfare is institutionalized. What we have today is an acceptance that this is not going to come to individuals and to collectives who are in the margins. We are left to handle this on our own. In India's modernity project, the state has always played an important role. It has organized opportunities for growth and development, for building solidarities between groups and networks within received inequalities of caste, community, and gender distinctions, of forging new social and cultural ties of being a nation. It had to build trust networks across these divides. What this pandemic has exposed is that no longer is this possible. No longer do we have a regime which is interested in to reach out to those who are deprived of reproducing their life. In fact, what we see is the state intervening, and this is what Tista and Kalpana have said: state intervening to create creates in ways and procedures through which it can perpetuate violence against those who demand that this trust be reconstituted. And the state and the violence against the populace has increased, just as the violence between the populace as well as between men and women has increased. This breakdown of ties creates an opportunity for people to start thinking of new ways to handle state and our society. And I think that the I would like to recall at this time one intervention made by Akhil Bilgrami, when he said that when the protests against CAA in December and January started first in Delhi and across the country, for the first time in the world, an abstract idea called the Constitution was identified with, and people wanted to bring back the Constitution. As we discuss tomorrow, the Constitution Day, I think it's important to bring back those imaginaries of what happened in December and January, because today this epistemic window has opened up a new way of thinking both of state and what kind of society we have. So my analysis, my assessment today is that risk analysis opens up ways ways in which social order has got organized and institutionalized over the decades, and it opens up ways in which we can reproduce life without and reproduce a new state which can be accountable to the people rather than being distant from it. Thank you.
Thanks, Sujata, for ending, I would say, on a rather optimistic note, though I think what you have really pointed out, and in a very interesting framework of trust and risk, and to the breakdown of trust in society, and the manner in which the pandemic was handled as a law and order problem, leading to more and more surveillance and repression wherever there was transgression. I think I know we're running late, but I think we've had some very, very rich presentations. So can we, Vatsala and Putul, can we have a little time for questions?
Yes, yes, of course. Of course, yes, please.
Yes. So Vatsala?
Who is this? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, Vatsala?
Actually, as of now, we don't, we have comments in the chat box, but no questions so far. I request all the participants to kindly put your questions, if any, in the chat box.
Vatsala, it doesn't matter if there are no questions as such, but if there is something notable, you know, a comment that you could share with the panelists.
Okay, okay.
Maybe that could spark off something.
So as Anita is writing, excellent insights gathered from respected fraternity. Then there are comments related to, there are general comments, not specific comment. I guess one new comment has come.
Okay.
Okay, so there are no specific comment or feedback, but yes, everybody is appreciating the way all panelists have brought in multiple perspectives, multiple insights, and everybody is feeling so privileged to listen to these voices. And I'm sure all students and participants have. So there are no specific comments so far.
Okay. So Putul, then do we wrap up?
It's up to you. It's up to you, Kiran. In fact, you could
No,
perhaps
I mean,
carry that dialogue further, because very important points have been. I mean,
no,
I'm still.
I'm just asking if we,
Hello.
Yes.
Hello.
No, well,
Yeah.
I don't think I am at all qualified to, in a sense, comment, because each of them has been extremely insightful and, added, I would say, to all the things that we ourselves have experienced and learning about the pandemic. I think there are 3 points that I would, call out from this discussion. One, that I think all the speakers, in a sense, have reiterated the point that it's not really the pandemic per se, but the manner in which the pandemic was handled by this right-wing Hindutva state that has led to this huge dispossession that we are witnessing today. And as Sujata points out, really, what is going to be the kind of social order that we are going to try and put in place and think about as a consequence of all this. The second, that the point that again all 3 of them raised, that the present lockdown and the repression that went with it is actually a part of a continuum. And it's not just this particular lockdown and the manner in which the state used it for its, different types of repressive measures. But the fact that we can trace it back to much earlier, and of course Kashmir and Assam, but even earlier, and therefore the nature of an increasingly repressive capitalist state that we are now, actually living with. I think that's an important point. And I think the third point, that the manner in which inequalities have exacerbated in this period, and the further stigmatization of different sections of our society which have already been stigmatized in many ways. So whether it's workers living in so-called slums, or whether it's Dalits, or whether it's women, or whether it's transgenders, all of us, or minorities, all of us demonized as unclean and, in a sense, responsible for the pandemic, as Tisa pointed out, the manner in which, the demonization of the Muslim community as if they were responsible for the pandemic. So it's actually these sections which are now seen as to be kept away, distanced from, and responsible for the kind of situation that we are in, when actually, as most of us think, it is really possibly Namaste Trump that actually led to the initial spread of COVID in this country. So I think, all the speakers have brought out very, very different and important aspects of how the pandemic has affected us in many ways. And since this is a conference of women's studies scholars, I hope that this session will, in a sense, inspire many of our young scholars to now look into these different aspects and perhaps undertake more research and micro studies that will contribute to this debate. So I thank the organizers, and I thank them for inviting me to be a moderator of this very, very interesting session. And thank you all. And I hope that you will be with all of us for the next 3 days, where we have different aspects of this whole theme of gender and citizenship, which are being debated in the different institutions that are part of this collaborative effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kiran.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So with this, we have come to the last segment of today's session. And on behalf of the Research Center for Women's Studies, SNDT Women's University, I offer sincere thanks to all our speakers. My thanks to the IAWS President, Dr. Meera Velayudhan, EC members, all collaborators, and the convener of this Western Regional Conference, Professor Vibhuti Patel, for providing us an opportunity to collaborate and coordinate the inaugural day of the 4-day conference on gender and citizenship. I would also like to thank all collaborators of this conference. I record my sincere gratitude and appreciation towards each speaker of first session, Professor Veena Punacha, Professor Meena Gopal, Professor Shaila D'Souza, Dr. Nirmala Jadhav, Dr. Swati Gayatri, for highlighting the critical issues women's studies is facing as a discipline, for raising voice for the career, livelihood concerns of the existing staff and the future of students, for brilliantly bringing in the core challenges before women's studies and women's studies centers concerning the diversity, language, curriculum, breaking academic isolation, and building academic community. Significant idea of the labors of mentoring relationship. Being in women's studies is not an easy exercise. Women's studies is not just a body of knowledge. We acknowledge it as a political location. Thank you, panelists, for deliberating upon significant questions and concerns the women's studies and women's studies centers are grappling with. I also extend my heartfelt gratitude towards each panelist for session 2. Civil rights activist Teesta Setalwad, Professor Kalpana Kannibaran, Professor Sujata Patel, Professor Kiran Moge, for being with us today, sharing your experiences, for brilliant presentations, stimulating discussions, and bringing in multiple insights and perspectives on COVID-19 as an epistemic window, the ideas on the universality of pandemic, the diverse society, the arguments of risk and trust, the questions of building trust and trust network, how to understand information, how to reproduce society, how to improve health and economy, employment, etc. Thank you, panelists, for such an insightful session. I must record my sincere appreciation and thanks to all participants, faculties, social activists, students, and members of Indian Association for Women's Studies for joining the session and making it a success. I expect the same enthusiasm and energy during the next 3 days as well. I truly believe that it is the participants who make it happen. With this, we conclude the day 1 of the Western Regional Conference. I must mention that we will be sending the feedback form to all registered participants through email, and the e-certificate will be issued on receipt of the duly filled in feedback forms. Once again, I thank all participants and speakers. Thank you.
Thank you.